Hey friends! Glad you're here at Harryverse X. We've cooked up something special. Spawn was Harry's godfather instead of Sirius, and Hellspawn powers hunted every Death Eater to hell. Liking and subscribing really helps us out. Okay, story time. Chapter 1, The Cape and the Cradle. The rain came in sideways over Godric's Hollow that Halloween night, the kind of rain that didn't care what it interrupted. It hammered the cobblestones, flattened the last of the autumn leaves into brown paste, and hissed against the windows of a small house on the edge of the village where two people were trying very hard to pretend that everything was normal. James Potter had been pacing for 40 minutes. Lily could hear him through the ceiling, back and forth, the boards creaking in a rhythm that had started to feel like a countdown. She was downstairs with Harry, who was in his playpen stacking blocks with the kind of furious concentration only a 15-month-old can muster, apparently unbothered by the fact that his parents had barely slept in a week. Lily watched him knock the tower over, laugh at the sound it made, and start again. She tried to hold on to that laugh. It was the realest thing in the room. The knock at the door wasn't a knock. It was the door simply ceasing to exist. Lily didn't run. She grabbed Harry, she pressed him against her chest, and she ran upstairs screaming James's name, and James was already coming down, wand out, face white as paper, and they passed each other on the stairs for one suspended second where they both understood exactly what was happening and what the other one was about to do. James went down. Lily went up. The rest is the version everyone knows. What nobody knows, what the history books don't record and Dumbledore never disclosed, is that there was something else in Godric's Hollow that night. Not inside the house. Outside it, on the far edge of the street, standing in the rain that evaporated before it touched his shoulders. A figure that looked like it had been assembled from a nightmare's leftover parts. 7 feet of corrupted muscle and necroplasm wrapped in a black cape that moved like it was alive and angry. A face that was less a face than a record of damage, white bone where a jaw should be, burned scars that ran all the way up past where eyes should rest, 2 points of greenish-white light that served as eyes instead. Al Simmons. Once, Colonel Al Simmons, United States Marine Corps, CIA Black Operations, one of the most effective and remorseless killers his government ever produced. Then, dead. Then, something else entirely. Spawn. General of Hell's armies, except he'd told Hell to go to Hell, which had made the arrangements somewhat complicated. He was supposed to be in Edinburgh. He'd felt the wards break the way you feel a tooth get pulled, sudden, wrong, and then the absence of something that had been there a moment before. The flu had taken too long. The shadows he'd used to jump directly hadn't been fast enough. He was 43 seconds too late. He stood in the middle of the street and looked at the house with one wall blown open, smoke threading up into the wet sky, and a terrible stillness where there had been a family. The cape moved around him like a living thing registering grief. He stood there for exactly 5 seconds and then he moved. James was gone. He could tell from the doorway, that specific quality of absence that Spawn recognized the way a musician recognizes silence. He went upstairs anyway, because Harry's cry was threading through the smoke and the wrong kind of quiet, thin and confused and alive. The nursery was a mess of debris and settling dust. There was a crib on its side. There was a mark on the wall that looked like a spell had been born and died there. And in the middle of the floor, sitting in a scatter of broken mobile pieces, was a 15-month-old boy with a lightning bolt cut into his forehead and tears tracking through the dust on his face. Not screaming. Just crying, the way children cry when they've been frightened past the point where screaming helps. Spawn crossed the room in 2 strides and crouched down, which still left him enormous above Harry, and held out one massive hand. Harry looked up at the ruin of a face above him, the bone, the scars, the burning green eyes, and reached out and grabbed 2 of Spawn's fingers with both hands. Spawn made a sound that nobody would have recognized as him. Something low and rough that was trying to be gentle. "I've got you," he said. "I've got you, kid." Harry sniffled. Said something that wasn't quite a word. Gripped the fingers tighter. The cape settled around both of them like a wing. That was when Dumbledore arrived. He appeared at the edge of the property line in a way that managed to seem unhurried despite the situation, blue robes darkening in the rain, half-moon spectacles doing nothing to soften the calculation in his eyes. He took in the house. He took in the blown wall. He took in Spawn kneeling in the wreckage upstairs with James Potter's son, and something shifted in his expression, not surprise, exactly, but a rapid and precise reassessment. "Al," he said, from the street, because he was not foolish enough to enter the property uninvited when Spawn was inside it. "I'm glad you're here. I'm so sorry about James and Lily." Spawn stood up. Harry was against his chest, cape folding around the boy automatically, and Spawn looked down from the first floor through the blown-out wall at Dumbledore in the street. His voice when it came was flat and deliberate as a headstone. "Where were you?" It wasn't a question. Dumbledore absorbed the weight of it without flinching, which was either admirable or telling. "I couldn't have prevented this," Dumbledore said. "You know that. What happened here tonight is terrible, but it isn't without its, don't." The word hit the air like something physical. "Don't finish that sentence." "Not tonight." Dumbledore closed his mouth. Opened it again. "Harry needs to be placed with his family. The blood protection that Lily's sacrifice has created, he has family." Spawn looked down at Harry, who had found a fold of the cape and was investigating it with complete focus. "He's got me. Al. I have the utmost respect for what you are and what you can do. But Harry is a child. He needs a human upbringing. He needs, I know what he needs." Spawn stepped back from the broken wall, moving deeper into the house. "And it isn't a cupboard under someone's stairs." There was a pause. In the street, Dumbledore's expression did something complicated. "You can't know that," he said carefully. "I know Petunia Dursley." The name came out with a specific texture, the way Spawn said things he'd assessed completely and found wanting. "And I know what you're planning. You want to put him somewhere safe and managed and small, somewhere you can reach him when you need him. Somewhere he grows up not knowing what he is until you're ready to tell him. That's not going to happen." "What I want," Dumbledore said, and there was something in his voice now that wasn't quite steel but was in the neighborhood of it, "is for Harry to survive to adulthood. Voldemort's followers are still, let them come," Spawn said simply. And then he took Harry and left through the back of the house, into the dark and the rain, and was gone before Dumbledore could formulate a response to something that simple and that absolute. He raised Harry in a place that didn't have an address. It had been a farmhouse once, somewhere in the rural sprawl between New York State and Connecticut, the kind of place that appeared on old maps and then stopped appearing. Spawn had claimed it a decade before Harry was born, warded it with the kind of protection that wasn't technically magic, or wasn't only magic, and filled it over the years with books, mostly, because he'd always read, even when he'd been alive. The kitchen worked. The heating worked most of the time. There was a yard that went on longer than it should have before hitting Treeline. It was not a conventional childhood. But it was a real one. Harry grew up knowing what his godfather was and knowing what that meant without it defining every minute of his days. Spawn had been careful about that, careful in a way that suggested he'd thought very hard about how not to raise a child the way he'd been made into a weapon himself. Harry went to a local school until he was 8. He learned to read, to do maths, to interact with other children with a naturalness that probably should have been more difficult given the circumstances. He came home to a godfather who helped with homework at the kitchen table and occasionally answered the door to what might charitably be called supernatural solicitors with the patient, weary authority of someone who had been the most frightening thing in every room for 20 years. "What is that?" Harry asked once, age 6, from the kitchen doorway, watching Spawn have a quiet and apparently conclusive conversation with something that looked like it was made of darkness and had too many angles. "Debt collector," Spawn said, not turning around. "From where?" "Somewhere that won't be bothering us again." The thing left. Harry went back to his cereal. He asked about his parents naturally, the way children do, in bits and pieces over years rather than in one big wrenching conversation, and Spawn answered in the same way, honestly, without drama, filling the picture in gradually. James, brilliant, reckless, someone who laughed at the wrong moments and was right to anyway. Lily, the kind of smart that made everyone around her sharper just by proximity. What happened to them? Evil that had been building for a long time, and two people who stood in front of their son without thinking twice. Were you there? Harry asked, age 8, not looking up from the book he was reading. I was there after. Why didn't you stop it? I was too late. Harry turned a page. Oh. Then, after a moment, does that still bother you? Spawn looked at him for a long moment. The greenish light of his eyes shifted. Every day. Harry nodded like that was a reasonable and sufficient answer, which it was, and went back to his book. Spawn sat across the table and watched him read and felt something that he no longer had the right architecture to name but felt anyway. The magic started appearing when Harry was 4, small things at first, the lights in a room responding to his mood, a glass sliding across a table when he wanted it, his toys rearranging themselves in the night. Spawn tracked it carefully without interfering with it. He'd spoken to Dumbledore twice in the years since Godric's Hollow, once by letter, once through a very reluctant intermediary, and the arrangement, such as it was, seemed to be this: Dumbledore was watching. Dumbledore disapproved. Dumbledore was also smart enough to understand that the one negotiating tool he might have used, Harry's safety, was already being provided for more comprehensively than any Bloodward privet drive could have generated. Harry's magic, Spawn noticed, was different. Not stronger than it should be, not weaker, just textured differently, like a song played in the right key but on an instrument nobody had put a name to yet. The necroplasm had been in the house since before Harry was born. It was in the air, faint but persistent, and children who grow up next to something long enough absorb it the way they absorb language. Harry would never have necroplasmic powers, that wasn't how it worked, but something had happened at the cellular level, at the deep structural level of whatever magical children were made of. Something that Spawn kept to himself for reasons he didn't entirely examine. The letter, when it came, was 11 years in arriving. Harry was in the yard working on what appeared to be a complicated project involving a rope, a pulley, and a truly ambitious structural expectation of the Trilene. An owl dropped the letter at his feet, looked around at the property with the unease that owls always showed near Spawn's territory, and left at a speed that suggested it wasn't being paid enough for this. Harry picked up the letter. Read it. Came into the kitchen and put it on the table in front of Spawn. Spawn looked at it. Looked at Harry. I know what it is, Harry said. You told me about Hogwarts. I told you about Hogwarts. So I should go. Spawn picked up the letter. Read it through once, put it down, and was quiet for a moment in the particular way that meant he was considering multiple things simultaneously. Then, you want to go? I want to learn. Harry sat down across from him. He was 11 and already had the quality of stillness that Spawn had spent decades cultivating, not forced stillness, not the stillness of a child suppressing impulse, but the real thing. And there are things I can't learn here. You said so. I said there are things that can only be learned from other wizards. Right. Harry looked at him steadily. So. Spawn looked at his godson and thought about Dumbledore and chessboards and long games played with other people's lives, and then he looked at the boy who had asked him once, aged 4, why his cape moved like it was breathing, and Spawn had said because it's alive, and Harry had said oh cool and asked if he could touch it, and Spawn had let him. You go, Spawn said. But you go as what you are, not what they want you to be. Harry tilted his head. What does that mean? It means you don't shrink. Spawn held his gaze. It means you don't pretend. It means when people look at you and see the scar and the name and decide what you should be, you've already decided something else. Harry absorbed this with the seriousness he gave to most things. Then he nodded once, the way he nodded when something landed as a truth he intended to keep. Okay. And I'll be around. Obviously, Harry said, which was, somehow, the most Spawn thing he'd ever said. Diagon Alley was a revelation and Harry treated it like one, with interest, not awe. He moved through the crowd with Spawn at his shoulder, which meant the crowd moved out of their way in the instinctive fashion of people responding to a physical presence they can't categorize. Spawn was wearing the coat, a long, dark thing that wasn't quite the cape but shared its DNA, and his face was covered by a mask that managed to look like it belonged there without explaining itself. People stared. Harry didn't notice because he'd never lived in a world where people didn't stare when he was with his godfather. Gringotts first. The goblin at the door looked at Spawn with an expression that was not entirely unlike professional respect, which said something about the breadth of Gringotts's clientele over the centuries. The vault had more in it than Harry had expected, and he stood in the stone chamber looking at the money for a moment before filling the bag with the methodical efficiency of someone who had been taught not to be impressed by things that were just numerically large. "Did you know about this?" he asked Spawn, on the cart ride back up. "Your parents were careful people," Spawn said. "Your father's family had money going back a long way. Your mother made sure there were protections on it. She planned for this. Lily planned for everything." Something in Spawn's voice softened at her name in a way Harry had always noticed and never asked about directly. She was the kind of person who had a contingency for her contingencies. Ollivander's was next, and it was strange in a way that Diagon Alley more broadly wasn't. Mr. Ollivander emerged from the back of the shop like a man who had been expecting Harry for years and had complicated feelings about the meeting finally arriving. He looked at Harry. He looked at Spawn. He looked at Harry again, and something in his silver eyes sharpened with an attention that was different from the curiosity people usually showed. "Remarkable," he said softly, and it wasn't clear which of them he meant. The wands were interesting. The first 7 didn't work in the usual way, they moved, they sparked, they responded, but with a quality that made Ollivander pause each time and reach for something else without fully articulating why. The 8th wand was holly. Phoenix feather core, 11 inches, supple. It warmed in Harry's hand before he'd raised it, and the shower of red and gold sparks that followed was almost an afterthought. Ollivander handed it over and said, carefully, "Holly and phoenix feather." And the phoenix gave another feather that day. Just one other. He looked at Harry over the boxes. "It's curious that you should be destined for this wand, when it's brother." "I know about the brother," Harry said. Not unkindly. Not with drama. Just with the flat informational quality of someone declining a discussion they don't need. Ollivander blinked. Looked at Spawn. Looked back at Harry. "I see," he said, and sold him the wand for 7 galleons. Outside, moving through the alley toward Flourish and Blots, Harry held the wand in his hand and turned it over thoughtfully. The cape at Spawn's shoulder moved like it was interested. "It's connected to him," Harry said. "Don't let that define how you use it." "I won't." Harry pocketed it. "But it's worth knowing." They got the books. They got the robes, at Madame Malkin's, where Harry stood on the fitting stool and a blonde boy stood on the adjacent one and looked at him with a calculation that was immediately, transparently obvious. The boy introduced himself as Draco Malfoy with the expectation of recognition that comes from growing up in rooms where your name gets doors opened and conversations started. Harry looked at him with the even, unimpressed attention of a child raised by someone who had met actual demons and found them wanting. "Harry Potter," he said back. Didn't extend a hand. Wasn't rude. Just, present, in a way that didn't cede anything. Malfoy tried several angles. He mentioned Quidditch. He mentioned the school. He mentioned, with careful purpose, that some wizarding families were better than others and that it was worth knowing which were which before you made friends. Harry listened to all of it with polite interest and the distant expression of someone cataloging information without being moved by it. "I'll work it out myself," Harry said when Malfoy finished. Outside, Spawn said nothing for a full minute. Then, "What did you make of him?" "Smart. Scared. Performing." Harry thought about it. "His father's a Death Eater." "Was," Spawn said. Claimed otherwise after the war. Claimed. Claimed. Harry nodded. Filed it. September 1st arrived with the peculiar chaos of King's Cross, which was organized confusion at the best of times and was currently hosting several dozen families in a state of coordinated magical excitement. Harry pushed his trolley through the barrier between platforms 9 and 10 and stood for a moment looking at the Hogwarts Express, red and gleaming and breathing steam into the September morning, with genuine pleasure. Not wonder. Not anxiety. Just the clean simple pleasure of something beginning. Spawn had brought him to the barrier and stopped there. Not because he couldn't go further, or not only because of that. Because there was something right about Harry walking through alone. They both understood it. Dumbledore will want to talk to you, Spawn said. I know. Be polite. Harry's expression suggested he found this advice moderately amusing. And don't tell him more than he needs to know about how you were raised. Spawn held his gaze. Not because it's a secret. Because it's yours. Harry nodded. Then he looked at his godfather, the burned face, the green eyes, the cape that moved when there was no wind, and did something he didn't do often in public, which was to reach out and briefly press his hand against the back of Spawn's forearm. A short, solid contact. The kind that means I know and I'm fine and thank you all at once. Spawn put one hand briefly on top of Harry's head. It was enormous, that hand, and Harry's hair stuck up in 3 directions afterward, which was already its natural state. Stay out of trouble, Spawn said. Define trouble, Harry said, and picked up his trolley and walked through the barrier. He found a compartment near the middle of the train. He was reading by the time the ginger-haired boy knocked on the door, a textbook, actually, Hogwarts, a history, because Harry liked knowing the geography of the places he was going into. Everywhere else is full, the boy said, and his tone was a mixture of hope and preemptive apology that Harry found immediately likable. Is it all right if I sit down, Harry said, and moved his bag. Ron Weasley sat down with the energy of someone glad to have that particular anxiety resolved, and looked at Harry, and then looked at Harry's forehead, and then looked out the window with the performative casualness of someone not looking at Harry's forehead. Harry watched this process with amusement he didn't bother to hide. It's fine, Harry said. You can ask. I wasn't, Ron abandoned the pretense. Okay. Does it hurt? Not anymore. Does it do anything? Not that I've noticed. Which was partially true and specifically not the whole truth, but it was the honest version of the answer that involved the least complication. I'm Harry. Ron. Ron Weasley. He said it with a slight brace for a reaction, the brace of someone who'd said it before and gotten varying levels of oh, one of those. Harry offered none. You're actually not what I expected, Ron said after a moment. What did you expect? I dunno. More, he gestured vaguely. More something. Harry considered this. More famous acting. Maybe. Spend 11 years with a godfather who's been dead and come back from hell and see how impressed you are with being famous. Ron stared at him. A long, wide-eyed stare. Your godfather has been dead. And back. And you grew up with that? He made very good pasta, Harry said, which was true and which also seemed to be the detail that, more than anything else, convinced Ron that this was real and not some kind of elaborate wind-up. Normal people didn't defend the supernatural with pasta. That was somehow more convincing than anything. The trolley came. Harry bought enough food for both of them because Ron's lunch looked like it had been packed by someone who loved him and had nothing to spare, and he did it without commentary or ceremony, which was the only way to do it. Ron accepted this with the quiet dignity of someone who recognized grace when they saw it. The girl appeared not long after, bushy hair, neat robes, the very specific energy of someone who had prepared thoroughly for this journey and was determined to get it right. She looked at Harry, checked his forehead the same way Ron had, and had the decency to do it quickly. I'm Hermione Granger, she said. I've read quite a lot about you. Nothing accurate, probably, Harry said. She considered this with genuine thought rather than reflexive agreement. The books are contradictory. Some things must be wrong. Most things. He made room. Sit down if you like. This is Ron. I know who Ron is, she said, sitting, and somehow this was not condescending, merely factual. She opened a book. Harry opened his. Ron, with the adaptability of someone from a large family, pulled out his chocolate frog and accepted the situation. The three of them sat in comfortable, slightly companionable silence for the better part of an hour. Your godfather, Hermione said eventually, not looking up from her book. Al Simmons. There are references to him in magical conflicts of the 20th century but they're redacted. The Ministry apparently classified, Hermione, Harry said. She looked up. One thing at a time. She held his gaze for a moment, weighing something. Then she nodded and went back to her book. Ron made a small approving face that he thought Harry didn't see. Harry saw it. The boats across the lake were exactly what they should have been, dark water and a lit castle going up and up and up into a sky full of more stars than cities remember to show, and even Harry, who had calibrated his wonder carefully over 11 years of living with something genuinely extraordinary, felt something shift quietly in his chest at the sight of it. He let himself feel it without comment. Hermione was doing the same thing beside him, just with slightly parted lips and wide eyes, and Ron was doing it loudly with a specific variety of profanity that Professor McGonagall responded to with an eyebrow that could have stripped paint. Inside, waiting for the sorting, Harry stood in the line of first years and felt the castle. That was the only way to describe it, felt it, the way you feel a building that has been alive with human use for 1,000 years, the particular density of that much accumulated life. His magic responded to it with something like recognition, a tuning fork resonance that surprised him with its warmth. Quirrell was there. Harry noticed him the way he noticed things, catalogued him, filed the twitching, the nervous laughter, the way his eyes moved. There was something wrong with the defense against the dark arts professor in a way that Harry couldn't immediately articulate, something layered, something that smelled slightly off to a sense Harry didn't have a name for but trusted completely. He said nothing. One thing at a time. The sorting hat went on his head and sat there. 1 second. 5 seconds. 10. Dumbledore, at the head table, watched. The hat, from inside Harry's head, said, well. This is new. I've been told that before, Harry thought back. There's something here that isn't quite, the hat said, apparently struggling for vocabulary, normal. There's Gryffindor certainly, the courage, the fire, the stubbornness that'll probably get you into more trouble than anyone since the Marauders. But there's also something else. Something that isn't one of the 4 founders' categories. Something old. Where do I go? Harry asked, because the hat seemed like it needed redirecting. Gryffindor, the hat said, and there was something almost like relief in it. Definitely Gryffindor. Whatever else you are, you'll fight for people. You'll always fight for people. That's the thing that matters. Gryffindor, the hat said aloud, and the table erupted. Harry walked to the table and sat down next to a red-haired girl who introduced herself as Ginny Weasley's brother, Percy Weasley, who was prefect and wanted Harry to know this, and found Ron already materializing nearby, grinning, and Hermione making her way over, placing herself with the precise efficiency of someone who had already decided where she was going to sit and wasn't open to debate. At the head table, Dumbledore watched Harry with an expression that was simultaneously warm and calculating and very slightly something else. Not fear. Something in the neighborhood of very deep respect, the kind that has wariness underneath it. Harry met his eyes for one moment. Held them. Then he reached for the pumpkin juice. Later, much later, when the feast was over and the first years were following Percy to Gryffindor Tower in a stumbling, excited line, Harry paused on a landing where a window looked out over the grounds. It was deep dark outside. The grounds were black and silent and enormous. Somewhere out there, just beyond the wards, there was a particular stillness between the trees. A shape that didn't move like anything natural. 2 points of green light, too high off the ground to be anything small. Harry raised one hand, flat, a brief acknowledging gesture. The green lights shifted. Something that might have been a nod. Then it was gone, back into the dark, and Harry turned from the window and went to find his tower. The castle hummed around him, alive with 1,000 years of magic and the specific electric charge of 140 new children all starting something enormous at the same time. Harry walked through it all with his hands in his pockets and his eyes open and his heart, quietly and completely, at home. Chapter 2, The Weight of a Name. The thing about Hogwarts was that it never stopped moving. Harry figured this out in the first week, not just the staircases, which redirected themselves with the cheerful indifference of public transit, but everything. The portraits migrated between frames. Peeves redistributed himself through the castle like a particularly motivated weather system. The ghosts had opinions about hallway traffic and were not shy about sharing them. The whole place breathed and shifted and reorganized itself around its inhabitants in a way that reminded Harry, oddly, of the farmhouse, of a space that had a personality and was not going to suppress it for anyone's convenience. He liked it immediately. The classes were something else. Not bad, interesting, actually, more interesting than he'd expected. But the texture of learning here was different from what he'd grown up with. At the farmhouse, learning had been a conversation. Spawn would put a book in front of him and then they'd talk about it, argue about it, test it against reality wherever possible. Here, learning happened in rows, at a pace calibrated to the middle of the group, with a fixed ceiling that was only occasionally bumped against by the handful of students who wanted to push through it. Hermione was one of those students. She sat next to Harry in most classes and had apparently read all the relevant textbooks before arriving, which she demonstrated through the medium of answering questions before professors had entirely finished asking them. Harry watched this pattern with affection and a private recognition of the specific loneliness it produced, the loneliness of being the fastest person in the room, of looking around and finding no one keeping pace. He made a point of keeping pace with her. Not for strategic reasons. Because she was interesting, and because she was doing the thing she was doing alone, and he knew what that felt like. Potions was Thursday morning, and it was educational in ways Snape had probably not intended. The dungeon classroom had the specific cold of underground spaces that hadn't decided whether they were dramatic or merely damp, and Snape entered it the way people enter rooms they've decided to dominate before they cross the threshold. His robes moved like they'd been trained. His expression suggested he'd considered warmth as an option and rejected it on aesthetic grounds. He called roll. When he reached Harry's name, he paused, just a half-beat, the pause of a man recalibrating, and looked up. "Ah," he said. "Harry Potter." The name in his mouth had a texture like something being examined in a bad light. "Our new celebrity." The class made the small anxious sounds of students understanding a social dynamic was being established. Harry looked at Snape with the same open, even attention he'd given Draco Malfoy and Ollivanders, which was the same attention he'd given every new person in the last week, which was his default because Spawn had taught him that the only way to understand a thing was to actually look at it. "Professor Snape," Harry said. Not combative. Not deferential. Simply meeting him at his register and offering nothing surplus. Snape looked at him for one extra moment, the extra moment of a man finding the ground not where he expected it, and continued the roll. The questioning that followed was the kind of teaching that was only partly about the material. "What's the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane?" And Snape's face when Harry answered correctly, specifically, and without the performance of uncertainty that students usually offered when they weren't sure if they were allowed to be right. The Bezoar question. The hellebore. Harry answered each one cleanly and watched Snape process this, because it was interesting. Snape had a prepared picture of Harry Potter, pampered, famous, probably stupid or lazy or both, and reality was failing to honor that picture, and the conflict was visible in the precise control of his expression. Neville Longbottom melted his cauldron, and Snape descended on this with the energy of a man grateful for a simpler kind of correction. Harry watched Snape dismantle Neville's confidence with efficient cruelty and felt something cold and specific happen in his chest. He recognized the mechanics of it: find the person least able to push back, use them to establish the hierarchy, move on. He'd read enough history to know what that was. "Professor Snape," Harry said. His voice was completely level. What temperature should Neville have been maintaining in the third stage? The class went still. Snape turned from Neville to Harry with the slow precision of a pivot that was deciding something. "I beg your pardon. The cauldron trouble. Was it temperature, ingredient timing, or stirring rate? I want to make sure I'm watching for the right thing." Snape looked at him. Read him. Recognized, with a professionalism that Harry had to credit him for, that this was a request presented as innocuous that would be impossible to refuse without demonstrating something he didn't want to demonstrate. He answered. Correctly, technically, the answer that was the actual teaching underneath the humiliation. Harry wrote it down and nodded with the perfect neutrality of someone who wanted the information and nothing else. After class, in the corridor, Neville touched Harry's arm. He looked like someone who'd been braced for something and been surprised that it hadn't happened. "Thanks," he said, very quietly. "He was wrong to do that," Harry said simply. "You'll get better at potions." "How do you know?" Harry thought about it. "Because you care about getting it right. People who care always improve." He paused. "My godfather told me that." He was talking about something different, but it applies. Neville looked curious in the way people got when Spawn came up, which Harry was getting used to as a consistent feature of conversations. But he let it alone, and Harry liked him better for that. The castle's rhythms established themselves. Breakfast noise and the aerial chaos of Owl Post. Classes in a sequence that became familiar. The particular afternoon light in the library, where Hermione had essentially taken up residence and where Harry could often be found nearby, reading things that weren't on the syllabus but were more interesting for it. Ron came and went from the library with the honest discomfort of someone who found it physically tolerable but philosophically challenging, preferring the common room and chess and the kind of conversation that moved fast and didn't require citations. Harry liked Ron's company for what it was: uncomplicated, warm, funny in a way that wasn't trying to be, entirely reliable. The three of them had fallen into a specific gravitational arrangement without discussing it, the way friendships sometimes happen when they're right, not gradually but in the way a shape resolves when you've been looking at it from the wrong angle. Hermione would later say that she'd decided to trust Harry when he'd answered Snape in potions. Ron would say it was the food on the train. Harry, when asked, said he wasn't sure there had been a decision involved, which was not a satisfying answer but was accurate. Quidditch was a different matter. He'd known about it. Spawn had been briefly, diplomatically dismissive of it in the way he was dismissive of organized recreation in general, but watching practice from the grounds was different from having it described. The speed was real in a way that second-hand accounts failed to capture. Harry stood on the edge of the pitch one evening in early October and watched the Gryffindor team tear through drills at heights that should have been alarming, and felt his magic move in a way it did when something fit. McGonagall found him there. She appeared beside him with the quiet speed that was her specific talent and looked at the practice with an expression that was privately calculating something. "You've flown before," she said. "Not a question." "A few times." The farmhouse had had a field. Spawn had acquired a broom at some point, Harry had never asked how, and Harry had spent 3 summers on it, mostly teaching himself by trying things that seemed reasonable and occasionally being wrong about what was reasonable. "Come to the pitch tomorrow morning. 6 o'clock. She looked at him sideways. "And don't tell Fred and George." He came at 6. He took the broom he was handed, a Nimbus 2000, which he recognized and appreciated with the same quality of appreciation he gave to any well-made tool, and flew, and discovered that whatever he could do on a second-hand training broom in an overgrown field in Connecticut, he could do significantly better on this. The first time he went into a dive, McGonagall made a sound that might have been a contained profanity. He was seeker by the end of the week. He owned a Nimbus 2000. Ron was vibrating with reflected vicarious pride. Hermione, who did not care about Quidditch but cared about Harry caring about things, asked intelligent questions about the snitch and what the logical optimal strategy for the game was, and Harry answered, and somehow they spent an hour talking about game theory without either of them noticing that was what they were doing. Life at Hogwarts, Harry thought, was genuinely good. He had not expected it to be quite this good. He held this thought with the careful appreciation of someone raised by a man who had learned, over decades of extremely personal experience, that good things should be paid attention to while they're happening. Halloween arrived with the specific energy that only Hogwarts could generate around a celebration. The Great Hall transformed into something between a banquet and a theater, floating pumpkins and bats and an enthusiastic excess of candles, food that justified every superlative Ron applied to it. Harry ate happily and listened to the Hogwarts ghosts stage what appeared to be a jurisdictional dispute over one of the dessert tables, and watched Hermione explain to anyone who'd listen that the historically accurate origins of Halloween were more interesting than the commercial version, and felt, once again, the specific quiet warmth of being somewhere that was his. It was Hermione's absence that he noticed first, in the sharp way he noticed when any of the configuration of three was disrupted. Someone had said something to her. He'd caught the tail end of it, Ron's voice too loud in the corridor outside the bathroom, something about insufferable, something about books and cleverness. By the time Harry processed the exchange, Hermione had been gone for too long. He looked at Ron. Ron had the expression of someone in the early stages of understanding that he'd been an idiot. "She probably just went to the bathroom," he said. "She's been gone for 40 minutes. Ron stopped. The expression progressed. "Right." The troll walked through the wall of the girls' bathroom on the second floor with the cheerful obliviousness of something that didn't have a strong relationship with walls, and Hermione's scream tore through the stone corridor in a way that got Harry moving before he'd consciously decided to move. Ron was right behind him, which said everything about Ron that needed saying. The bathroom was a mess of shattered porcelain and displaced water and a 12-foot mountain troll that was currently between them and Hermione, who had backed herself into a corner and was doing the controlled breathing of someone choosing not to panic despite having excellent reasons to panic. The troll swung its club into the sink row. Ceramic exploded. Hermione flinched but held her ground. Harry looked at the troll. The troll had not noticed him yet. It was focused on Hermione with the simple predatory attention of something that measured the world in threats and things that weren't threats. He stepped into the bathroom. "Hey," he said. The troll turned. 12 feet of it, smelling like something that had been dead and then decided not to be, holding a club the size of a young tree. It looked at Harry with the small red eyes of something that did not process complexity. Harry was not afraid of it. That was the thing. He looked at the troll and felt not fear but the clean, activating alertness of a problem to solve. He'd grown up in a house where actual demons had occasionally shown up at the door. He'd been raised by something that made this troll look like a medium-level inconvenience. Fear was something he'd learned to use like a gear, not a state to live in. He raised his wand. The spell Flitwick had taught them last week, Wingardium Leviosa, which Harry had performed on the first try and then spent the rest of the lesson practicing with precision because it was more useful to do a thing well than to do it once, and he put it on the club. The club left the troll's hand and went up. The troll, with the perplexed outrage of a creature whose physics had been violated, grabbed for it. Harry moved the club sideways. The troll stumbled. Harry brought the club down onto the back of the troll's own head with a crack that resounded off every tile. The troll sat down with the authority of something that suddenly weighed 12 feet but couldn't be bothered to remain upright, and then it lay down, and the bathroom got significantly quieter. Harry lowered his wand. Looked at Hermione. Hermione was staring at him. She had a piece of basin in her hair. She looked like she was deciding between several possible responses and hadn't yet committed. "Are you hurt?" Harry asked. "No," she said. She looked at the troll. She looked at Harry. "You didn't. It was a troll, it was either that or wait for the professors and hope it didn't finish you first." He said it simply, without theater. Are you sure you're not hurt? Yes. I'm fine. She pulled the piece of basin from her hair and looked at it. That was very effective, actually. The application of Wingardium Leviosa to the weapon rather than the troll itself was, Hermione, Ron said from the doorway, where he'd arrived too late to do anything and was now doing the thing Ron did when events exceeded his preparation, which was to talk. You've got 3 professors about to come through that door. We should say you came to find her, Harry said quickly, glancing at Ron. She'd heard there was a troll and came looking for us because she thought we didn't know. All 3 of us handled it together. Hermione opened her mouth. Closed it. Looked at him with an expression that was making a calculation. That would get me in significantly less trouble. I know. The calculation resolved. Thank you, she said, and it had weight to it, the real kind, not the reflexive kind. The professors arrived. McGonagall was doing controlled anger, Snape was doing something more unreadable, and Quirrell was doing the performance of a man who had arrived after the crisis and was working very hard not to show relief. Harry let Ron do most of the talking and watched Quirrell's hands, which were absolutely still in a way that nervous hands never were, and filed the observation next to all the others. November ground in with cold and Quidditch practices that required commitment to the concept of warmth as theoretical, and Harry's first match loomed with the specific social energy of an event the whole school had decided mattered. Gryffindor versus Slytherin. The pitch on match morning was grey and indifferent to the occasion. Harry dressed in the changing room and listened to Oliver Wood deliver a team talk that was technically about Quidditch and emotionally about Oliver Wood's relationship with winning, and then went out into the grey and mounted the nimbus and rose and felt, as he always felt in the air, simply and entirely right. The match went normally for about 20 minutes. He spotted the snitch twice but lost it both times in cloud cover. The Slytherin chasers were aggressive in ways that were probably legal if you defined legal generously, and the Gryffindor chasers responded with escalating commitment. The crowd was loud in the half-pained, half-exhilarated way of people watching something they care about that could go wrong. Then his broom tried to kill him. It started as vibration, small, below the threshold of weather or turbulence, a very specific mechanical wrongness that a less attentive flyer might have missed. Then it bucked. Hard, once, and Harry held on with legs and instinct while the nimbus made a second attempt to dislodge him that was unmistakably intentional rather than atmospheric. He grabbed the handle in both hands and tried to steer and got nothing, and the broom made a third attempt that left him hanging from it by both hands at a height that made the people in the stands make sounds. He thought very clearly, someone in that crowd is doing this. He held on. Because that was the only sensible option, because falling was not preferable to holding on, and because in his experience the people who kept their grip through the worst of things tended to find the moment when it stopped. His knuckles were white. The broom lurched again. Below him, he could see the tiny figures of the crowd and the match coming to a ragged halt as people pointed up, and somewhere in the stands he was aware of Hermione moving with purpose. Whatever Hermione did ended it. The broom stopped its assault with a suddenness that left Harry swinging on it like a pendulum, and he wrestled himself back onto it properly and steadied, and then looked down and found the snitch about 3 feet from his face, hanging in the cold air with the mild indifference of a thing that had been there all along. He caught it with one hand. The roar from the Gryffindor stands was substantial. He landed and Hermione and Ron descended on him simultaneously, which meant he was briefly surrounded by anxious noise and the specific physical energy of 2 people who had been frightened for him and were now expressing it as the opposite of fear. You held on, Ron said, which was both the minimum and somehow also the exact right thing. What was it? Harry asked Hermione directly. She told him. Jinx on his broom, she'd spotted the wand movement. She told him who she'd disrupted when she'd knocked over Quirrell's robes trying to get to. She stopped. Looked at Harry's face. It was Snape, she said. I thought it was Snape. He wasn't blinking. He was shielding himself from the view, Harry said. From anyone seeing his lips. But then, it was Quirrell. The word landed in the air between the 3 of them with a specific weight. Hermione's expression went through several rapid reassessments. Ron looked between them. The bloke who was scared of the troll that he apparently let in. Ron said. Nobody let that troll in by accident, Harry said. The three of them stood on the pitch in the cold, the celebration noise around them as background, and looked at each other with the mutual understanding of people who have arrived at the same conclusion by different routes and found it equally uncomfortable. We tell Dumbledore, Hermione said. We tell him some of it, Harry said. What's the difference? The difference is that Dumbledore already knows more than he's telling us, and telling him everything we know means he knows what we know, and right now that's worth more if he doesn't know we know it. Ron stared at him. How do you just think like that? My godfather plays chess, Harry said, which was also not entirely a lie. December descended and the castle began its transformation toward the holidays with the enthusiasm of a place that had been doing this for 1,000 years and had not run out of commitment to the process. Decorations appeared as if by committee decision among the enchantments themselves. The cold settled in properly. Most students began the gravitational drift toward home for Christmas. Harry was staying. This wasn't a sad decision. He'd written to Spawn and the response had been concise, occupying 4 lines of parchment in the handwriting of someone who found parchment vaguely unreliable but was willing to work with it. Stay. Learn the castle. I'll be outside the wards. Write if you need me. Ron was also staying, to his own evident surprise. He'd told his mother he wanted to stay for the experience and his mother had sent back a response that took 3 pages to cover the range of her feelings, concluding with a care package and a grudging permission. Harry suspected the real reason was simpler and hadn't asked. Hermione went home, and the castle felt slightly different after, the way a chord changes when you remove one note, not wrong, just different. The mostly empty castle was its own kind of excellent. The staircases still moved but less frantically, like a system running without peak load. The library expanded in feel if not dimension. Harry explored corridors he hadn't had time for and found the castle rewarded the attention, small rooms, odd chambers, a roof section that wasn't on any map and had a view of the grounds that was worth the cold. He found the mirror on the 4th floor. He hadn't been looking for it. He'd been following a sequence of right turns that the castle seemed to be suggesting and ended up in a dark, high-ceilinged room with the specific smell of stored air and occasional use. The mirror was enormous, taller than Spawn, framed in gold with a carved inscription that took him a moment to parse, Eris stra eru oit ube kafru oit onwosi. He worked the reversal. I show not your face but your heart's desire. He looked into it. He'd read about this mirror. Dumbledore had written about it, obliquely, in a paper Harry had found in Spawn's library, filed between things on other dangerous artifacts. He knew what it did. He knew the story of men wasting away in front of it, starving for a reflection. He stood in front of it and looked. What he saw was this, himself, maybe 10 years older, in a world that looked like the present but felt settled. Standing with Ron and Hermione, older versions, comfortable in themselves. And beside him, Spawn, not the burned and scarred figure of his daily life, but something easier, a shape that was still enormous, still wore the dark coat, but stood differently. Unburdened. The green eyes in the mirror weren't guarded the way they usually were. They were the eyes of someone who'd put something down. Harry looked at this for a long moment. Then he turned away from it and walked out of the room. Not because it hurt, or not only because it hurt, in the particular private way that seeing things you want clarifies how much you want them. He turned away because he knew what the mirror did to people who stayed, and he had been raised by someone who had spent 20 years making choices that serviced other people's definitions of what he was. Harry had watched that happen and learned from it the way you learn from anything done near you with enough repetition. He had no intention of standing in front of a mirror and being defined by it. He wrote the location of the mirror to Spawn that night. Not with a specific request, just because Spawn should know where dangerous artifacts were in the castle he was half-guarding. The response came the next morning, 1 line, good that you looked. Better that you walked away. It was in the quiet of a January evening, the holidays ending, the castle refilling, that Harry sat in the common room after dinner and let himself feel what had been accumulating since September. Not homesickness, the castle was home in its own right now. Not loneliness, because Ron was 3 feet away losing at chess, and the sound of Hermione's return through the portrait hole was imminent. It was something else. A low-frequency awareness that something in the castle was building toward something. Quirrell's nervous wrongness. The third-floor corridor that everyone had been dramatically warned away from. The mirror. The troll. The sequence of it had a shape. Something was here. Something worth protecting. And something was hunting it. He'd felt this before, not in his own experience but in Spawn's stories, told at the kitchen table over years, the stories of a man who had learned to read threat the way others read weather, by texture and accumulation and the specific quality of coincidence that stopped being coincidence. Harry didn't have the full picture. He had the corners, the edges, the suggestion of the thing in the middle. Ron lost his chess match and looked at the board with the philosophical acceptance of someone who'd known it was coming. "You're making that face," he told Harry. "What face?" "The one where you're working something out and it's not something I'll like." Harry looked at him. Ron met the look with the steady uncomplicated reliability that was his specific gift. "Something's going to happen before the end of the year," Harry said. "I don't know what yet." "Something bad?" "Probably." Ron was quiet for a moment. Then, "Right. Well." He reset the chess pieces. "That's for later, then. Play me. You'll lose but it'll take your mind off it." Harry moved his first piece. Outside the castle, in the darkness past the wards, a shape moved between the trees, patient, unhurried, a specific kind of vigilant that had no off switch. 2 points of green light in the dark, pausing once to look toward the lit windows of Gryffindor Tower, and then continuing the slow circuit of the perimeter. On the other side of the glass, without turning, Harry felt it. The way he always felt it. The way he'd felt it his whole life. He moved his queen's pawn and lost track of the cold outside and the thing building in the castle's deep corridors, because Ron was already gesturing at the board with the enthusiasm of someone who had a plan, and Hermione was coming through the portrait hole with her hair still travel-damp and her bag overfull of books she'd apparently acquired over the holiday and an expression that said she was ready to tell them something about all of it. Harry let the rest of it go for one evening. Some things could wait. This couldn't. Chapter 3, What Lives in the Dark. The third-floor corridor smelled like dog. Harry noticed this the second time he passed it, not the first, when the smell had been faint enough to attribute to the castle's general idiosyncratic atmosphere, but the second time, walking back from the library at 9:30 on a Tuesday night with a charms essay under his arm and Hermione beside him insisting they could still make it back before curfew if they moved with purpose. The smell hit him from under the locked door and he stopped dead and Hermione walked 2 steps past him before registering his absence. "Harry. Something's in there," he said. She came back. Sniffed. Made a face. "It smells like dog. Very large dog." He looked at the door. It was locked in the specific way of doors that wanted you to know they were locked, a thick, deliberate quality to the silence behind it. Extremely large. The headmaster said to stay away from this corridor. He did, Harry agreed. They looked at each other. Hermione had the expression she got when something violated her academic instincts, which it clearly did, because the question of what was in that corridor was objectively more interesting than returning to the common room by curfew, but also she had the expression she got when she was thinking about consequences, which she took seriously in a way that Harry respected even when it produced different conclusions than the ones he arrived at. "The dog is guarding something," Harry said. "Obviously the dog is guarding something." "What, I don't know yet." He held her gaze. "But the thing it's guarding is what Quirrell wants." She was quiet for a beat. "Then, we should go back." "Yes. And we should find out more before we do anything else." "That's what I was thinking." "I know it's what you were thinking." I'm saying it because if I say it then it's actually the plan and not just the thing that sounds like the plan while we're actually walking into something. Harry looked at her with the specific appreciation he reserved for Hermione's particular kind of precision. Fair, he said. They went back. Hermione's information-gathering process was methodical in the way that impressive things often looked simple from the outside. Within 3 days she had established, through cross-referencing 3 different library sources and 1 conversation with Professor Flitwick, that she'd angled with what Harry privately thought was fairly sophisticated misdirection, that Nicholas Flamel had been Dumbledore's research partner 40 years ago, and that Nicholas Flamel had made the Philosopher's Stone, and that the Philosopher's Stone produced the elixir of life, and that someone had moved the Philosopher's Stone to Hogwarts for safekeeping roughly 6 months ago. She delivered all of this in the library, sitting between them with a stack of books and the controlled energy of someone who has been waiting to say something for a while and has finally earned the right to say it. So the stone is here, Ron said. In the castle. Under the dog. Under whatever's under the dog, Hermione said. There are almost certainly additional protections. Multiple professors contributed enchantments, according to what Hagrid said. When did you talk to Hagrid? Harry asked. I didn't talk to Hagrid. I talked near Hagrid. There's a difference. She looked slightly pleased with herself. The point is there are layers. But the access point is the 3rd floor corridor. Harry had been thinking. Quirrell is working for Voldemort, he said, using the name the way Spawn had taught him to use it, as a word, not a weapon, not a curse, just the designation for a specific threat to be analyzed. Ron made a small involuntary sound. Hermione absorbed it better. He's been trying to get to the stone since at least the start of the year. The troll was a distraction. The broom jinx was opportunistic, he was trying to get me out of the picture before I could complicate things. Can he get through the protections? Ron asked. He hasn't yet, Hermione said. But the fact that he's still trying suggests he hasn't worked out how. What's the one thing he needs to get past all of it? Harry asked. They both looked at him. Someone who wants to find the stone to use it, he said. Versus someone who wants to find it and not use it. He let that sit. I read about the Mirror of Erist. I think that's the last protection. Dumbledore's protection. The mirror, Hermione said slowly, working it out. You see what you desire. If you desire the stone for use, you'd see yourself using it. But if you only want to find it, you'd see yourself with it. Actually holding it. And then it would appear. Ron stared at him. That's a clever trap. Dumbledore is a clever person, Harry said. The word clever was deliberately neutral. The problem is that Quirrell's been possessed. He's not entirely himself. His desire is Voldemort's desire, and Voldemort wants the stone for something specific. To come back, Ron said. To come back. But he's been half dead for 10 years. The desire might be, Harry paused, working through the logic. Complicated. Hermione was looking at him with the particular expression she used when she was catching up to something. Harry. How do you know Quirrell's possessed? I've known since September. How? He thought about how to say it. I can feel something wrong with him. Something layered. My godfather taught me to pay attention to that. There's a quality to certain kinds of wrongness that you learn to recognize if you're around enough of it. Hermione sat with this. Does your godfather know about the stone? No. I haven't told him. Why not? Because Spawn would come inside the wards, Harry didn't say. Because Spawn would solve this problem in a manner that is conclusive and non-reversible, and that would mean I never get to. He said instead, because this is something I should handle. With you too. Ron and Hermione exchanged a look over the books. The look lasted about 2 seconds and contained an entire conversation. Right, Ron said. Obviously, Hermione said. Spring arrived grudgingly, like a landlord who'd been sent too many complaints and was finally making a minimal effort. The grounds thawed and turned to mud and then to something almost green, and the Quidditch season wound through its remaining matches with the dramatic commitment of a competition that had decided March and April were the appropriate months for crisis. Harry flew. He played well in the way that was natural to him by now, not showing off, not performing, just doing the thing the way it wanted to be done. The match against Hufflepuff he ended in 4 minutes. Slytherin, rematch, he made last deliberately, not because he was making a point but because the game was interesting and he wanted more of it. The snitch was doing something complex near the goalposts and he spent 11 minutes running a geometry problem in his head before the solution presented itself and he went for it. Wood nearly cried. Harry let him. The year's quiet carried the shape of things building underneath it. Exams appeared on the horizon and Hermione leaned into them with religious intensity and Ron expressed his exam anxiety through the medium of chess games that became increasingly aggressive and a vocabulary of complaints that Harry listened to with genuine patience because this was what Ron needed and Harry understood what it meant to need something expressed out loud before it got smaller. Harry himself studied with the comfortable application of someone for whom learning had never been adversarial. He sat for the written exams with the ease of a person who'd been having the relevant conversations for years, and sat for the practical components and thought about what he was doing in the specific technical way Spawn had taught him to think about things, not the result, but the mechanism, not the destination but the quality of the path. Snape watched him throughout the exam period with an attention that Harry had started to understand better. There was history there, Spawn's history with James Potter, which Harry had assembled from fragments over the years. There was whatever Snape had been in the war and chosen not to be anymore, which was a story Harry didn't have all of but could read the shape of. Snape was not a simple man, and Harry extended him the courtesy of not treating him like one. He gave Snape nothing to use and nothing to dismiss and eventually Snape seemed to make his peace with this, or at least stopped actively trying to create friction. He's watching you differently, Hermione observed, after potions in May. I know. Like he's trying to work something out. He is. What is he trying to work out? Harry thought about it. Whether I'm worth protecting, he said, which wasn't the whole answer but was the true part of it. Hermione looked at him with the full weight of her attention. Are you? Ask me in about a month, Harry said. The night they went for the stone was June, and warm, and the castle was winding down from exams with the specific relieved energy of a pressure system releasing. Which meant the corridors were full of students who'd finished their last paper and were experiencing the euphoria of unstructured time, which meant moving through them unnoticed required actual effort. The invisibility cloak helped. It had arrived by owl in November with a note that said only your father's. Happy Christmas. In Dumbledore's handwriting, and Harry had used it twice, appreciated the quality of the enchantment, and filed it as a useful tool without the sense of mystical inheritance that Dumbledore had probably intended it to carry. He'd told Ron and Hermione, standing in the common room at 10:30, keeping his voice even, Quirrell's going tonight. I don't know how I know. I just know. Hermione had put down her book without argument. Ron had stood up from the chessboard. Neither of them asked how he was sure, which was the thing about them that mattered most. Under the cloak, 3 people pressing close in the corridor outside the third-floor room, Harry felt the quality of the night, the particular vibration of a thing that had been waiting to happen tipping toward happening. He unlocked the door with Alohomora and pushed it open and they slipped through. The dog was enormous. Cerberus built, 3 heads, and one of them was already turning toward the smell of warm humans before Harry registered that all 3 heads were currently doing the sideways heavy head drop of an animal on the edge of sleep. On the floor near its feet was a small harp playing itself, the music thin and slightly mechanical. He's already been here, Hermione breathed. Harry looked at the trapdoor between the dog's paws. And gone down. He crouched and assessed. The harp was winding down, the magic in it guttering. We have about 2 minutes before that thing wakes up. The harp, Hermione said, and she already had her wand out. She put an aglamenti on the harp that wasn't water but was the first step in a sequence and then came the spell she'd apparently been working on in her spare time, something of her own construction that Harry recognized as novel without being able to immediately classify it, and the music continued, steadier and more consistent than the enchanted harp had managed. The dog's 3 heads settled. Harry looked at her. She shrugged, which was Hermione, for I prepared for this. The trapdoor. Down. Devil's Snare was first, the rush of plant life and the immediate, strong curl of tendrils around limbs that responded to struggle by intensifying. Ron panicked, which was completely understandable, and Harry went still with the practiced ease of someone who had learned from Spawn that the correct response to something trying to hold you was to stop giving it leverage. Hermione got fire going from her wand and the plant released them in the resentful way of things that have been denied. The flying keys were next, a room full of enchanted keys on wings and a row of brooms and a door that needed the right one. Harry had the broom off the rack before the others had finished registering the situation and was in the air, and then it was just the geometry problem again, the moving shapes and the fixed point of the correct key and the question of interception. He found it in 40 seconds, the old, battered one with the bent wing, and dove for it and caught it and was back on the ground before Ron had finished being impressed. The chessboard was Ron's moment. Harry knew it as soon as he saw the scale of it, life-sized, requiring players, the kind of problem that had a specific right solver, and stepped back and let Ron step forward with the expression of someone who has been preparing for something his whole life without knowing it. Ron played the board with the cold precision of a general, which was not who Ron was in daily life but was, apparently, who Ron was when the board demanded it. He called moves for Harry and Hermione and then sat himself in the night spot and took the blow that opened the board and did it without flinching. Harry knelt next to him after the pieces settled. Ron was conscious, sitting in the rubble of the night, his face the color of old chalk. "Go," Ron said. "I'm fine. I'm just, go." "Hermione stays with you," Harry said. "Harry," Hermione started. "Someone needs to send for help. You're better placed to navigate back up and get to a professor. Ron needs someone with him." He held her eyes. "I need to know you're both safe while I'm doing this." "That's not a limitation, Hermione. It's why I can move fast down there." She looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone receiving an argument they don't entirely accept but can't fully defeat. Then she nodded, one sharp dip. "Don't do anything," she started. "I'll do exactly what needs to be done," he said. He went through the door. The potion room was Snape's work, logical puzzles and fire, a riddle about safety and danger and the specific correct bottle among 7. Harry read it once, worked it through, selected correctly, drank it, and moved forward into the cold of the final chamber. The mirror was there, standing in the center of a high stone room that smelled like deep underground and old magic. And Quirrell was in front of it, looking at his own reflection with the controlled frustration of a man who had been trying the same thing for too long without results. He turned when Harry entered. The expression on his face did something complicated, the nervous, twitching Quirrell expression shifting under something else, something colder and older, like a mask slipping sideways. "Potter," Quirrell said, and it was his voice but it wasn't. "We've been expecting you." Harry looked at him. At the stutter that wasn't, at the fear that had always been performance. He thought about September and the smell of wrongness and all the months of watching. "Not Quirrell," he said. "Not really." Something in Quirrell's face shifted fully. The nervous quality dropped away. What was left was very still and very old and looked at Harry with an intelligence that had been calculating a long time and had made a significant error somewhere. "No," the voice said. "Not really. He wants to possess you," Quirrell said, still Quirrell, but from somewhere under the other thing, the desperate remnant of a man trying to warn through his own mouth. "He'll do it to you like he did to me." "Quiet," said the other thing. And Quirrell's body went still. Harry stood and looked at what was in front of him and felt the specific quality of darkness that came off it, not the darkness of the house's occasional infernal visitors, not the careful shadow work of Spawn's necroplasm, but something older and more essential, a darkness that had chosen itself deliberately and been choosing itself for decades. "You've come for the stone," Harry said. "Not a question. I've come to take back what was being kept from me." The voice moved through Quirrell's mouth with the ease of something very familiar with the architecture it was using. "Step aside, boy. I have no quarrel with you tonight. You killed my parents. I've killed a great many people." It sounded like a fact rather than a boast. "That is simply what I am." "What you chose to be," Harry said. Something flickered in Quirrell's face, the ancient thing looking at him differently. Reassessing. Harry walked to the mirror. Stood in front of it. Looked at his reflection and saw himself standing in a world that was clear and free and right, and in his hand was a small red stone, and then the mirror's enchantment registered his intention and something dropped into his pocket with a weight that was heavier than it should have been for its size. He turned around. "I have it." The stillness in the room changed texture. Quirrell moved toward him with the fluidity of a body being directly controlled, the hesitation and nervous tick all gone, replaced by something that walked like a predator. "Give it to me," the voice said. "I will be merciful. I will let you live." "No," Harry said. The curse came fast. Harry moved faster, not elegantly, not with technique, but with the deep physical instinct of someone raised to treat danger as something you moved through rather than froze in front of. The spell cracked into the stone where he'd been standing. He was already sideways, already close, and he grabbed Quirrell's arm. The scream that tore out of Quirrell's body was not Quirrell's scream. It was something beneath that, something that had taken residence in living flesh and suddenly found the flesh becoming uninhabitable. Harry held on. His hand on Quirrell's skin was burning, his skin was burning, a pain that was clean and specific and informed him that whatever the protection in his blood was, it was active and violent and doing exactly what it was made to do. He thought, "Mom." He thought, "Thanks." He held on. Quirrell's wand arm went up, the second curse, and Harry let go of the arm and grabbed the wand hand instead, and the stone walls of the chamber cracked around them from the misdirected spell, and Quirrell screamed again in a voice that had harmonics no human throat should produce. The thing inside him was trying to leave. Harry could feel it, the wrongness gathering, concentrating, preparing to vacate the host. He reached into his pocket. He held the stone in his other hand. And he thought about what Spawn had told him, years ago, at the kitchen table, when Harry had asked what happened to things that died badly. "Depends," Spawn had said, "on what they were and what they owe. What does this one owe?" Harry thought now, and let the stone's warmth run through his grip. The dark thing screamed. It left Quirrell's body in a rush that made the air in the chamber taste like ash and old metal, and it swept toward Harry, toward the stone, toward anything living and warm enough to sustain it, and Harry stood his ground with his feet planted in the debris of the chamber floor and his hand closed around the stone and his face absolutely open. The dark thing hit the wall of what Harry was and recoiled. There was a silence. Then a sound like something enormous moving very fast through very small space. Then nothing. Quirrell crumpled. Harry caught him before he hit the floor, an automatic response, human instinct before anything else, and lowered him, and looked at the man's face, which was the face of someone relieved and exhausted and done, the face of someone who had been carrying something terrible for a long time and had finally been allowed to put it down. "Is it gone?" Quirrell managed. "From you," Harry said. "Yes." Quirrell's eyes closed. The breathing continued, ragged but present. Harry looked at the door of the chamber. Then up, as if he could see through the stone above him to the castle and the grounds and the darkness outside. He thought about green eyes in the tree-line. He stood up. Walked to the center of the room. Held the stone up to what light there was and looked at it, red, and warm, and carrying the weight of what it could do, what people had died and been corrupted trying to get. Then he sat down on the floor of the underground chamber, his back to the mirror, and waited. Dumbledore arrived 8 minutes later. Harry knew it was him by the quality of footsteps, unhurried, the tread of someone certain enough of their authority that urgency became optional. The old headmaster stood in the doorway of the chamber and looked at Harry sitting cross-legged on the floor with the stone in his hand and Quirrell unconscious beside him, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded Harry had ever seen it. Not surprise. Not relief. Something slower than either, something that was recognition moving toward reckoning. "Harry," he said. "Professor." Harry looked at him steadily. "He's alive. He needs a healer, what the stone was doing to the host body while, I know." Dumbledore crossed to Quirrell, assessed him with a swiftness that spoke to genuine medical competence, conjured a stretcher. Then he straightened and looked at Harry. "The stone," he said. Harry held it out. Handed it over without theater. Dumbledore took it and looked at it and then at Harry with an expression that was making several calculations simultaneously. "You could have kept it," Dumbledore said quietly. "I know. You chose not to. Keeping it would have been the problem continuing," Harry said. "The stone is the target. The stone being gone is the solution." Dumbledore looked at him in the way that Harry had started to identify as his real attention, not the warm, slightly theatrical attention of a headmaster managing his students, but the focused assessment of the man underneath. "You knew what it was before you came down here?" "Yes." "For how long?" "Since about October." "And you waited?" "I learned what I needed to learn first." Harry stood up, brushing stone dust from his robes. "And I wanted to handle it myself. It was extremely dangerous, Harry. You could have come to me. Would you have dealt with it differently?" Harry asked. Not aggressively. Genuinely curious. Dumbledore was quiet for just long enough to answer the question without answering it. "You weren't harmed," he said finally. "My hands burned." Harry showed the palm, red and damaged in the way of something healed improperly from the inside out, already better than it had been 5 minutes ago but still visible. "It'll be fine by morning." Dumbledore looked at the hand. Then at Harry's face. Then, with the expression of a man revising a long-held position, "Your godfather has known roughly what was happening, in outline. And he trusted you to handle it. He trusts me to be what I am." Harry held the old man's gaze. "He doesn't make me smaller to keep me safe. There's a difference." Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. The chamber was still and cold and smelled of the aftermath of dark magic, the specific acrid quality of something that had tried to take root and been burned out. "I imagine," Dumbledore said finally, "that he and I will need to speak properly soon." "I imagine you will," Harry agreed. Madame Pomfrey kept him for one night in the hospital wing on the basis of the hand and what she called residual magical exposure and what was actually, Harry suspected, Dumbledore buying himself time to think. The hand was fine by morning as predicted. The residual magical exposure cleared itself the same way, his body processing and discarding what didn't belong with the quiet thoroughness of someone who had spent 11 years in close proximity to necroplasm and had, at some cellular level, developed opinions about what it would and would not sustain. Ron arrived at 8 in the morning with a cast on his arm and the expression of someone who had woken up in the hospital wing and been told he'd successfully played through a concussion, and was currently experiencing that information as something between pride and mild bewilderment. Hermione arrived at 8:15 with books, which Ron looked at, and then looked at Harry, and then accepted as an immutable fact of Hermione. "Did you get it?" Ron asked. "And gave it to Dumbledore." Ron took this in. "Did you fight? Was there actually, Voldemort?" Harry said, using the name deliberately, watching Ron's small involuntary flinch with the patience of someone who understood the flinch and also intended to help break it by demonstrating repeatedly that the word was just a word. "Possessing Quirrell." "Yes." Hermione put her book down. "Harry. You were alone down there with, I know what I was down there with." He met her eyes. "I handled it." The silence that followed had several layers. What was on top was concern. What was underneath that was the specific respect of people who had seen someone do something and understood, without requiring it to be explained, that they'd seen something real. "Okay," Hermione said. Which was, for Hermione, the equivalent of a standing ovation. That afternoon, the letter came. It arrived through the hospital wing window by an owl that had the slightly wild-eyed quality of a bird that had flown harder than expected to get somewhere faster than expected. The letter was 5 lines. Spawn's handwriting, which was compressed and slightly angular, as if each letter was being written by someone who still found the process of translating thought to physical marks slightly alien. Heard you had an eventful night. The castle tells on itself to people who know how to listen. You handled it well. What was in that professor needs watching, it isn't done. It was never going to end in one night. Come home for the summer. Tell your friends they're welcome. And Harry, I know what you walked away from in June. I know what it cost. You did it right. Harry read this once. Folded it. Put it in his pocket. Ron was watching him. Good news? Good news, Harry said. Outside the window, the grounds were bright with late June and the approaching chaos of end of year. Students were beginning to appear on the grass, the castle releasing its population into the summer with the specific exhalation of a place that breathed differently when it was full. Somewhere in the village beyond the wards, an owl was already making its way back to the edge of the Connecticut tree-line. Harry looked out the window and thought about what Spawn had written. It isn't done. It was never going to end in one night. He knew that. He'd known it since October. He thought about a half-dead Dark Lord burning off Quirrell's body and scattering into the June night, wounded and reduced and looking for somewhere to wait, the way things that had decided to survive at any cost always found somewhere to wait. He thought about what was coming. He thought about it clearly and without flinching, which was not the same as being unafraid, which was not the same as being ready. He was 11. He had time. He had 2 friends sitting 3 feet from him who had walked into an underground death gauntlet with him without being asked twice. He had a godfather who was the most comprehensively violent protector that had ever walked the earth, and who had taught him what that violence was for and what it wasn't for. He had a wand with a phoenix feather core that was connected to the wand that had made the scar on his head. He had, he thought, looking at Ron now losing an argument with a chocolate frog card and Hermione already deep in the book she'd been carrying since 8:15, everything he needed. The chocolate frog card, when it landed face up on his bed, was Albus Dumbledore. Harry looked at it. The portrait Dumbledore in the card looked back at him with the expression of a man who had been thinking about something for several months and had recently had his thinking significantly complicated. Harry flicked the card back to Ron. Keep it, he said. You haven't got his one. Chapter 4, The Diary and the Dark Summer at the farmhouse was a specific kind of good that Harry had never found anywhere else. It wasn't comfort exactly, or it wasn't only comfort. The farmhouse was too strange for conventional comfort, too full of the residue of what Spawn was and what Spawn did for the heir to sit entirely normally. But it had a quality of safety that went deeper than locked doors and good wards, the kind of safety that came from being in proximity to something that had decided, at a fundamental level, that nothing was getting through it. Harry had grown up inside that decision. He knew its texture the way he knew the sound of the farmhouse's particular creaking at night, which was different from threatening creaking in ways he could no longer explain because he'd absorbed the distinction too young for it to be conscious knowledge. Ron arrived the second week of July with a single overfull bag and the expression of someone who had been braced for something impressive and was now recalibrating what impressive meant. He stood in the front yard and looked at the farmhouse and the tree-line and the particular quality of the afternoon light, which was normal, and then he looked at the edge of the yard where the grass gave way to shadow in a way that was not entirely seasonal, and he looked at Spawn, who was standing on the porch, and he didn't say anything for a full 15 seconds. Spawn looked back at him. You're taller than I thought, Ron said finally. Something in the green light of Spawn's eyes shifted. You're shorter. Yeah. Ron absorbed this. Does that mean something? Height-wise. Is that significant to what you are? No, Spawn said. Right. Ron picked up his bag. Cool. Harry, beside him, had the expression of someone who had been waiting for that exchange for approximately 1 month. Hermione came 4 days after Ron, arriving by Muggle taxi from the local town because her parents had insisted on a conventional journey and she had not had the energy to explain that conventional was a negotiable concept at this particular address. She stepped out of the taxi with 2 bags and a look of calm, thorough readiness that Harry recognized as her standard equipment for new situations. She assessed the farmhouse, the yard, the tree lean, Spawn on the porch. Then she walked up and extended her hand. "Hermione Granger," she said. "Harry's told me a great deal about you." Spawn shook her hand, which required some physical management on both their parts given the scale differential, and said, "He's told me about you. You built a sustained charm for a magical instrument on the fly in a crisis situation." Hermione blinked. He mentioned that first." The look Hermione turned on Harry was complex and warm and slightly undone. Harry found something very interesting to look at in the middle distance. The 3 weeks of summer that followed were the kind that get referred back to later in life as the baseline, the thing other summers get measured against. They were loud and comfortable and full of the specific pleasant chaos of 3 people whose individual rhythms were different enough to be interesting but compatible enough not to produce friction. Ron discovered Spawn's chess set, which was made of something that wasn't quite wood and moved with a predatory intelligence that delighted him. Hermione discovered Spawn's library, which covered topics that the Hogwarts library's restricted section would have required permission slips to approach, and disappeared into it for significant portions of each day. Harry trained. Not formally, not on a schedule, but in the way he'd always trained, finding the edges of what he could do and pressing on them with the patient curiosity of someone who trusted the process. Spawn worked with him in the evenings, in the field behind the farmhouse, practicing the kind of magic that Hogwarts wouldn't get to for years. Not dark magic, the distinction mattered, and Spawn was precise about it in ways that Harry had grown up understanding. Dark magic was magic that consumed. What Harry was learning was something more like structural understanding, how spells worked at the mechanism level, why certain enchantments failed under specific pressures, how to make what he was doing more real rather than more powerful, which was a different kind of more. "You're stronger than you were in September," Spawn said one evening, watching Harry disassemble a conjured construct with a precision that would have puzzled most second-year professors. "I know." Harry let the construct settle into nothing. "Is that going to be a problem? At school? In general?" Spawn was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was choosing words carefully rather than having nothing to say. "Only if you let it become one. Power without shape is just noise. You told me that before." "Worth repeating." Harry turned to face him properly. "What was in Quirrell?" "Voldemort. He's not done." "No. Where is he?" "Somewhere small and dark and waiting," Spawn said. "Some things that have been trying to survive for a long time get very good at waiting." "How long will he wait?" "Until someone gives him what he needs." The green eyes were steady. "Until someone gives him a body, or something close enough to one. It could be years. But it won't be forever, because something that wants what he wants doesn't choose patience. It just endures it." Harry thought about this. He thought about a half-dead fragment of a dark wizard somewhere in the Scottish countryside, or Eastern Europe, or wherever things like that went when they were driven out of a host. Thin and cold and furious and patient. "When he comes back," Harry said, "he'll be worse. He'll be more committed," Spawn said. "Things that have been diminished tend to compensate." "Right." Harry picked up his wand and set up another construct. "Then we should be ready." The Weasleys arrived at King's Cross on September 1st in the specific magnificent chaos that Harry had learned was simply their natural state. There were 6 of them moving through the station, Fred and George in front, Percy behind them with the expression of someone managing a diplomatic incident, Ginny between Ron and her mother, Arthur Weasley doing the thing he always did, which was stop and look at Muggle appliances with the open delight of a man who found everything interesting. Molly Weasley saw Harry and covered the distance between them in a time that suggested she had strong feelings about standing still when Harry Potter was in range. "Look at you," she said, which meant several things at once. Then, "Both of you," pulling Ron in, you wrote 4 times over the summer and every letter was shorter than the last. I was busy, Ron said. Busy, she repeated, in the tone of a woman for whom busy was not an acceptable response. She released them and looked at Hermione, who was standing at a slight angle from the group with the expression she wore in rooms full of people she was still learning, and Molly's expression did the thing where it simply included her, warmly and without negotiation. Hermione, dear. Did you have a good summer? Very educational, Hermione said, which Ron made a face at and Harry kept a careful expression through. The express was familiar now. Harry moved through the crowded platform and found their usual compartment with the ease of someone who had developed a preferred geography in a new space. The year had the feeling of something with its mind already made up, not anxious exactly, but present, the way the summer had been present, full of information that hadn't resolved yet into a clear shape. Draco Malfoy appeared in the compartment doorway about an hour into the journey. He had Crabbe and Goyle with him, who served the function of architectural features in most of his entrances, and he had the specific quality of tension that Harry had been noticing all year, the performance of ease over a substrate that wasn't quite. He looked at Harry. Heard you had quite the year. All very heroic, apparently. Decent year, Harry said. Ran into a few things that shouldn't have been in the castle. You could say that. Malfoy's eyes moved to Ron, assessed, moved to Hermione with a quality that Harry filed immediately as something he would need to address at some point, and then came back to Harry. You should be more careful about the company you keep, Potter. Second year's more serious. People start to notice things. Like what? Harry asked. Like who your friends are. What families they come from. What kind of wizard you're planning to be. Harry looked at him for a moment, the full, even look he used when he was reading something. I'm planning to be the useful kind, he said. That's the only kind that matters. Malfoy looked back at him with the slightly uncertain quality of someone who had prepared for a different response and wasn't sure what to do with this one. Then he left, and Crabbe and Goyle moved after him with the smooth inevitability of tidal objects. Ron exhaled. He gets worse every time. He's scared, Harry said. Malfoy's scared of you? His father is scared of what's coming, Harry said. And Malfoy can feel it. He's been watching his father be afraid for months and he's translating it into aggression because that's what he's learned. He paused. That doesn't excuse it. But it's what it is. Hermione was looking at him with the expression she used when he said something that surprised her. When did you start analyzing Malfoy's psychological state? September 1st, first year, Harry said. Seemed worth understanding. The new defense against the dark arts professor was Gilderoy Lockhart, who arrived at the first lesson with the energy of a man who had decided the world was a stage and had cast himself extremely generously. He was handsome in a way that had clearly been maintained with significant effort, his teeth occupying more visual real estate than strictly necessary, his robes suggesting a relationship with his own appearance that was, charitable framing, thorough. He looked at the class. He let the look linger on certain faces. He smiled. Now, he said, I know what you're all thinking. You've read the books, and of course you have, and you're wondering whether the man in front of you can really be the same person who subdued the Wagga Wagga werewolf and recovered the Eye of Trafalgar single-handedly. The class provided the murmuring acknowledgement he was clearly expecting. Harry provided nothing. Lockhart's eyes landed on Harry with the specific attention of a man who had plans for the famous student in his class. Harry Potter, he said, with the warmth of someone claiming a shared achievement. I'd say we're two of a kind, you and I. Both famous before we were old enough to choose it. I wouldn't say that, Harry said. He kept his voice level, not unkind, just precise. Something flickered behind Lockhart's eyes. An assessment recalibrating. Modest, he said, and turned back to the class. Harry watched him through the lesson, the charm of him, the easy way he held a room, and underneath that the specific texture of a performance so practiced it had almost become real. Almost. Harry had grown up watching Spawn be what he was without performance, and it had given him a very precise sensitivity to the gap between being and displaying. Lockhart was all display. The substance underneath it was a question he filed for later. The answer arrived faster than he expected. Lockhart's defense work was technically competent and experientially hollow. He could describe what things were and what they did and had clearly read extensively, but when he demonstrated, something was wrong at the level of the wand work. The motions were right. The intention was empty. Harry watched this for 3 lessons before he understood it fully. Lockhart had learned magic academically, as decoration. He'd never had to use it for something real. He mentioned this to Hermione. She was quiet for longer than he expected. Then, the books, she said slowly. Some of the accounts don't, there are inconsistencies. In the timing. In the geography. She looked at him. You think he took credit for things other people did? I think someone memory charmed all the original sources. Another silence. He has a very good memory charm apparently. Better than everything else, Harry said. Yes. Hermione sat with this for a moment and then went back to her work with the expression of someone who has moved something from the category of suspicion to the category of confirmed hypothesis and will be proceeding accordingly. The first attack came in October. Or that was when they found it, when Harry came around a corner on the 2nd floor and stopped at the sight of the words on the wall. Red. Large. The script of someone making an announcement. The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the air, beware. Below the words was Mrs. Norris, Filch's cat, suspended by her tail from a wall bracket. Stiff and grey-eyed and not quite dead but not quite alive, the specific horrible middle state of petrification. Harry looked at it. Around him students were beginning to gather, the crowd noise of Discovery building, and from down the corridor he could hear Filch's footsteps already coming. He looked at the wall. He looked at Mrs. Norris. He looked at the floor and found what he was looking for, a small puddle of water, the trail of something that had moved through here recently, and a certain quality to the air that had nothing to do with magic in the Hogwarts sense and everything to do with something significantly older. He thought, snake. He thought, big one. Harry. Hermione was at his shoulder, arrived without him noticing, her voice low. We should move. I'm reading the scene, he said, the same way he'd say it at the farmhouse when Spawn was walking him through the habit. Filch is going to arrive in about 30 seconds and find us standing here next to his petrified cat. This was an entirely valid point and Harry accepted it, stepping back from the message as Filch rounded the corner and the situation became, as predicted, complicated. Lockhart materialized with the timing of a man who had heard a crowd forming and come to be visible in it, and the whole thing devolved into a scene that Harry watched from the inside with the patient detachment of someone waiting for the relevant information to surface. Dumbledore arrived. Snape arrived. The crowd consolidated opinions. Harry stood in the middle of it and thought about a snake large enough to petrify a cat by looking at it, and thought about a chamber that the school's history acknowledged and its current administration preferred to treat as mythology, and thought about a weapon that could kill and had specifically not killed, which meant the weapon had some kind of control over its use. Which meant something was controlling it. He wrote to Spawn that night. The response came with the dawn, 4 lines, chamber is real. Salazar Slytherin built it. The weapon is a basilisk, a 1,000-year-old one if the chamber dates to the school's founding. It kills with direct eye contact. Don't look directly at it. Find the entrance. How do I find the entrance? A second letter arrived 3 hours after the first, follow the spiders. They'll be evacuating. He didn't tell Hermione and Ron everything right away. Not because he was keeping secrets, he wasn't built for keeping secrets from them. The 3 of them had become the kind of unit where information wanted to be shared because it was more useful that way, but because he needed to understand the shape of the thing first. There was something else happening alongside the basilisk. Something that wasn't just a monster following old orders. The attacks were too targeted, too timed, and they were escalating with a pattern that suggested intent. Hermione arrived at the answer before he'd finished working toward it. He found her in the library on a cold November afternoon with a book open to a page on serpent evolution and a piece of parchment covered in her compressed, precise handwriting, and she looked up when he came in with the expression of someone who has assembled a thing and is waiting for someone else to confirm it. "Basilisk," she said. "I know. You knew already. Since October." She held his gaze. "And you didn't say." "I was working out the rest of it." "And the rest of it is?" Harry sat across from her. "Someone is controlling it. Or directing it. Someone here, or something here, that has access to a monster that should be impossible to control and is using it with specific intent." He paused. "And the intent isn't killing. It's been avoiding killing. Every person who was petrified could have been killed. They weren't." Hermione's eyes sharpened. "Why spare them?" "Because killing students shuts the school down. Petrifying students keeps it running. Keeps whoever is doing this with access." He turned it over. "What do you want with a school full of children?" She was quiet. "Then, practice. Testing. A controlled environment." She leaned forward. "Or a very specific target. Someone who's here and can't leave because they're a student." They looked at each other across the library table. "Me," Harry said. "Possibly you," she said carefully. "Or, there's something else. There were attacks on Muggle-born students specifically. The message on the wall. Enemies of the air. Slytherin's specific obsession was pure-blood ideology. The chamber, the monster, it's all framed as purification. Which means whoever's directing this has absorbed that ideology enough to be directing it selectively." Harry tapped the table. "This isn't just Voldemort trying to get back. This is something that has his ideas specifically." Hermione was very still. "A piece of him?" "A piece of him," Harry agreed. "Preserved somehow. Old." The library was quiet around them. "We need to find the entrance," Hermione said. "I'm following the spiders," Harry said. Ron handled the revelation about following spiders with the specific stoic courage of someone confronted with his worst thing and choosing to walk toward it anyway, which Harry thought was one of the most genuinely brave things he'd ever seen and said nothing about because Ron would have found that unbearable. They followed the spiders on a cold December night under the invisibility cloak, through the forbidden forest, and found Aragog's colony, and the conversation with Aragog would have been immediately fatal for anyone not carrying the specific combination of Harry's absolute refusal to accept death as an option and Ron's white-knuckled determination not to be the one who ran first. Aragog told them nothing useful except what Hagrid had been accused of 40 years ago, and by the time Harry had processed this against the timeline the Ford Anglia arrived and they left before the spiders made a collective decision. In the car, shaking slightly, Ron said, "I'm never doing that again." "You probably won't have to," Harry said. "Probably. Likely." "Harry. Almost certainly." Ron stared at him. "Do you sleep at night?" "Yes," Harry said. "You develop a certain accommodation." The diary arrived in Harry's dormitory on a Thursday in January, inside a parcel that had been sent to the wrong room and redirected. No note. A plain black diary, the leather cover worn smooth from handling, the pages completely blank. T.M. Riddle printed in faded gold on the inside cover. Harry held it for a long time. He didn't open it. He could feel it. That was the thing, he could feel it the same way he'd felt Quirrell, the same way he felt anything that had darkness in it of a specific intentional variety. The diary had weight beyond its physical weight. It had presence. It was aware of being held. "It's him," he told Hermione, handing it to her carefully. "A piece of him. Old, 50 years at least. Written into it somehow." She took it with her wand out, cast 3 diagnostic spells in rapid sequence, and looked at the results with an expression that passed through several phases and settled on controlled urgency. "This is extraordinary and extremely dangerous. There's consciousness in here. Preserved. It's been active, It's been talking to someone. Who? She hesitated. Hermione. The attack started after Ron's sister arrived, she said carefully. Ginny Weasley. She's been quiet since September in a way that, I noticed it but I didn't know what I was noticing. Harry was on his feet before she finished the sentence. Ginny Weasley was 10 years old. She was at Hogwarts for the first time, in a family that loved her but was large enough that certain things could get missed, and she had found a diary that listened. That asked questions. That told her she was special and understood and smart. A diary with 50 years of experience manipulating people and the specific predatory genius of a 17-year-old Tom Riddle, who had been the most charming person in any room he'd chosen to enter. Harry understood exactly what had happened. He understood it with the cold clarity of someone who had read enough history and been raised by someone who had seen enough of what power without conscience did to the willing and the unwilling alike. He found her in the library. She was sitting alone with the diary open in front of her and a quill in her hand and the look on her face of someone very far from the present. He walked to the table and sat across from her and said her name, and she looked up with the slow return of someone coming back from a distance. Harry. Her voice was thin. Ginny. He reached across the table. Can I see that? Her hand went to the diary. A small reflex, a flash of something in her eyes that wasn't hers, something that had been practicing the use of her reflexes. Then she blinked and the thing was gone and she was just 10 years old and frightened. I don't know what I've been doing, she said, very quietly. Harry, I don't, there are things I don't remember, I know, he said. It's not you. It was using you. He held out his hand and waited, patient and present, until she put the diary into it. Then he closed it and set it on the table between them with his hand flat on the cover and said, It's over now. Whatever it made you do, it wasn't you. Do you understand that? She looked at him with the eyes of someone who wanted very badly to believe something. How do you know? Because I've seen what it looks like when something uses a person, he said. And I know the difference. He held her gaze. Ron's up in the common room. Come on. He didn't destroy the diary that night. He thought about it seriously. He had the necroplasm adjacency in his blood, the specific corroding quality that had burned Quirrell's skin, and he suspected direct contact between the diary and his palm would do something significant to whatever was living inside the leather and ink. But he thought about Ginny, and about months of possession that she didn't remember, and he thought about the right way to close something rather than simply the fastest way. He wrote to Spawn instead. The response came before dawn, a Horcrux. Part of a soul preserved in an object. Destroying it requires something that can kill what lives in it, not just damage the container. Basilisk venom. Phoenix tears to survive the venom's contact effects. There will be a way, look for it. Don't go alone. And Harry, this is the second piece of him you've encountered. He made more than one. This is not the end of it. Harry sat on his bed with the letter in one hand and the diary on the desk and looked at the grey pre-dawn light through the dormitory window and thought about Horcruxes. Thought about a man who had divided his soul deliberately, multiple times, to make himself unkillable. Thought about what that said about the man. Thought about what it would take to end it completely and whether this year was the year that would happen. Not this year, he decided. Not yet. The board wasn't ready. But the diary needed to go. The chamber entrance was in the girls' bathroom on the second floor. Moaning Myrtle, the ghost who occupied the plumbing with a possessive misery that drove most students away, told Harry what had happened to her in a conversation that he handled with genuine attention and care, because Myrtle had died terrified in a bathroom and had been treated as scenery ever since, and that mattered. The sink, she said. He spoke to it. In a hissing language. Harry crouched in front of the sink. He thought, snake. He thought about the quality his voice sometimes had when he was half asleep or very focused, the quality Ron had pointed out once in an odd tone and Hermione had immediately begun researching. He hadn't confirmed it for either of them yet. He opened his mouth and let the sound that came out be the sound that wanted to come out. The sink moved. Hermione, behind him, made a sound. Ron made a different sound. "You're a Parselmouth," Hermione said. "Apparently," Harry said, looking at the pipe entrance in the floor. That's associated historically with, I know what it's associated with." He looked at her. "I'm going down. Both of you stay up here unless I'm not back in an hour, and then you go to Dumbledore." "Harry," Ron started. "Not this time." He met both their eyes. "The thing I'm going to face down there, it's not like the troll. It's not even like Quirrell. This is something that was built to kill, that kills by looking at it, that's been here for 1,000 years. I need to move fast and alone, and I need to know you're both safe above ground." The silence was the kind that contained argument but chose not to deploy it, which was the kind he loved them most for. He dropped into the pipe. The chamber was vast and cold and very old, the green torchlight and the carved serpents and the ceiling dripping with condensation and the specific quality of a space that had been waiting a long time and had no feelings about the wait. Harry moved through it on the balls of his feet, his wand out, his eyes down or to the side, never straight ahead unless he was certain, because the basilisk moved in the dark and its gaze preceded it. Tom Riddle was there. Not Quirrell, Riddle himself, reconstituted from 50 years of diary and Ginny's life force, visible in the dim green light as a teenager who was also not entirely present in the physical sense, still somewhat translucent, still drawing strength from the diary that lay on the floor beside him. "Harry Potter," he said, and his voice was everything his younger self would have designed for this moment, controlled, amused, the voice of someone who had imagined this meeting many times. "I've been hoping to meet you properly." "I know what you are," Harry said. "Memory preserved in a Horcrux. Piece of a soul." Something flickered in Riddle's expression. The prepared script slightly disrupted. "You know about Horcruxes." "I know about Horcruxes." "Remarkable." He tilted his head, studying Harry with the genuine curiosity of someone who had expected less. "Who taught you?" "Someone who's been dead and found it educational," Harry said. He could hear the basilisk. Not directly, the sound came through the stone, the immense weight of something enormous moving through the tunnels that threaded through the chamber's walls. He held his position. "You can't fight it," Riddle said. "You can't fight me. I'm going to complete what I started, and you're going to, what you started," Harry said, "is going to end here." He raised his wand. But not with a spell. He looked at the diary. He reached into himself, not magic, not exactly, but the deep structural thing that was in his blood after 11 years of proximity to what Spawn was, the necroplasm-adjacent quality that had burned Quirrell's skin, that the mirror of Eriste had reflected something different than it showed other people. He reached for it deliberately, intentionally, and he pressed his palm flat against the diary's cover. The sound the diary made was not a sound any paper object should make. It was the sound of something that had been confident becoming suddenly uncertain. Riddle looked at him with the first expression that wasn't calculated, genuine alarm, a flash of the child underneath the performance. The basilisk hit the chamber proper. Harry threw himself sideways and the air above him moved with the passage of something enormous and fast, and he felt the wind of it, the incredible heat of living thing that big and that old. He kept his eyes down. He could feel the basilisk's gaze sweeping the chamber, the deadly visual radius of it, the kill field. What came next came from above. The phoenix arrived in fire and wind and the specific golden brightness that cuts through underground dark like nothing else, because fire doesn't care about atmosphere, and Fawkes, Dumbledore's phoenix, who had apparently decided that what was happening in the chamber warranted attendance without being summoned, hit the chamber with all the directional intent of something that knew exactly what it was for. It put out the basilisk's eyes. The screaming from the 1,000-year-old serpent was catastrophic, and Harry was already moving, on his feet, his wand in hand, and Fawkes dropped the sorting hat in front of him with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a magical creature that had made a decision and was following through on it. Harry reached into the hat and his hand found the hilt. The sword was real. Cold and heavy and real, the rubies in the hilt catching the green light and throwing it back warm. Godric Gryffindor, he read on the blade, in the half-second before the basilisk's tail swept him off his feet. He hit the stone. Got up. The basilisk was blind and furious and enormous and completely deadly in 3 out of 4 directions, and Harry moved through the 4th direction with everything Spawn had put in him, the years of training, the understanding of mass and momentum and the simple physics of things that were bigger than you but only dangerous if you were where they expected. He went up the serpent. Up the length of it, along the spine, and drove the sword into the roof of its skull. The fong went through his arm on the way down. He landed badly and lay still for a moment and looked at the ceiling and thought very clearly, that's basilisk venom. I have about 5 minutes. Tom Riddle crouched beside him. You'll die, he said, and the alarm was gone from his face and the calculation was back. And when you die I take enough life force to become real. And then the diary, Harry pressed his hand harder against the diary. Fawkes landed on his arm. The tears were warm and immediate and the venom pulled back from the wound with the speed of something overruled, and Harry felt the pain go from active to archived and he was already sitting up, already looking at Riddle's face, already taking the sword in his offhand. Your turn, he said. He drove the sword through the diary. The sound was the sound the diary had made under his palm, multiplied past the threshold of a thing simply declining into a thing ceasing. Riddle's form shredded from the feet upward, the translucence going to transparency going to absence, and Tom Riddle's 17-year-old face, in its last fraction of presence, showed something that wasn't calculation and wasn't performance. It was the face of a boy who had spent his entire life being afraid and had chosen to make everything else afraid instead, and was now, at the end, simply afraid. Then he was gone. Harry sat on the floor of the Chamber of Secrets with a sword across his knees and an arm that was completely healed and a diary that was now just leather and the ghost of 50 years of carefully constructed personality, and he breathed. Fawkes sat on his shoulder and was warm. Thank you, Harry said. Fawkes made a sound that carried no translation but needed none. Harry picked up the destroyed diary, cleaned the sword on his robes, and looked at the chamber around him, the vast stone space, the carved serpents, the dead basilisk lying like a geological feature along the length of the floor. 1,000 years of Slytherin's legacy, and a 50-year plan, and a fragment of the most dangerous dark wizard in a century, all ending here in the greenlit dark. He thought about what Spawn had written, this is not the end of it. He knew. He'd known before he came down here. There were more pieces. More Horcruxes, more fragments of a soul that had decided survival was worth any price. More things between here and the end. He got to his feet. Fawkes, obligingly, took him up. Dumbledore was waiting in his office when Harry arrived. He looked at the sword, the destroyed diary, the completely healed arm, and the phoenix settling on its perch. He looked at Harry for a long moment with the full weight of his real attention. Sit down, he said, and the warmth in his voice was genuine, and so was the thing underneath it, the thing that had been recalibrating since June last year and was now doing it again. Harry sat. He was tired in the deep physical way of someone who had used everything they had, but he was also clear. Completely clear. The way you feel after something that was building finally resolves. You should know, Harry said before Dumbledore could begin, that it was a Horcrux. Dumbledore went very still. And you should know that it wasn't the only one, Harry continued. I'd like to know how many more there are, Professor. Not as a student asking a teacher. As someone who's going to be dealing with them either way and would prefer the information. Dumbledore looked at him. The half-moon spectacles. The long face with its history. The eyes that were always calculating and sometimes, underneath all of it, simply tired. You are, he said slowly, very much not what I expected, Harry. People keep saying that, Harry said. How many Horcruxes? Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached for a dish of sherbet lemons and held it out, and Harry shook his head, and Dumbledore looked at the dish and then set it aside with the expression of a man putting something small down before picking something large up. Let me tell you, he said, about a boy called Tom Riddle. Chapter 5, the things that cannot be consumed. The Ministry of Magic had the architecture of an institution that had decided permanence was the same as rightness. Harry had visited it twice before this, once with Spawn when he was 8, a quick navigation through the visitor entrance to sort out a registration issue that Spawn had addressed with the flat patience of someone who had dealt with bureaucracies significantly older and more threatening than this one, and once at the start of third year when Dumbledore had quietly arranged for Harry to understand how the wizarding government worked on the grounds that understanding the structure of a thing was the first step to not being controlled by it. Both times Harry had walked through the atrium with its golden fountain, the witch, the wizard, the centaur, the goblin, the house elf, all looking up at the human figures with the arranged expressions of a story someone very powerful had decided to tell about the natural order, and felt the specific chill of an institution that had confused its own comfort with truth. Third year had a different texture from the first two. The first year had been discovery. The second had been the specific focused urgency of something building toward a point. Third year arrived with the quality of a held breath. The whole wizarding world seemingly paused around a name that kept appearing in newspapers, on wanted posters, whispered in corridors. Sirius Black. Mass murderer. Escaped from Azkaban. The first person to escape from Azkaban, which the Ministry kept pointing out with the energy of people who very much wanted you to understand that this was unprecedented and not in any way their fault. Harry read the stories and thought about what Spawn had told him, in pieces over the years, about that Halloween night and what came after. What Spawn had told him was this: Sirius Black had not been at Godric's Hollow. He had arrived after Spawn, by some minutes, to an already concluded scene. He had taken the motorcycle and gone after Peter Pettigrew with the specific intent of someone who had just understood they'd been betrayed by someone they trusted with everything. What had actually happened in that street, between Sirius and Peter, was something the official record had got badly wrong in ways that were only possible if the official record had been constructed by someone who wanted a specific conclusion. You knew he was innocent, Harry had said, age 12, after Spawn had told him this in the simple direct way he told Harry difficult things, at the kitchen table, no preamble, no management of the revelation. I knew what the scene at the house told me, Spawn had said. And I knew Sirius. He was your father's best friend. He chose this family as his own. People don't betray the things they've chosen. The people they betray are the things they were assigned. Peter was assigned to the Potters. Peter was assigned to the Potters, Spawn confirmed. And Peter chose Voldemort. A pause. Sirius has been in Azkaban for 12 years for what Peter did. Harry had sat with that for a long time. 12 years. He'd been 15 months old when it happened. He was 12 now. Sirius Black had been in Azkaban for his entire conscious life, for a thing he hadn't done, while the man who had actually done it had been living as a pet rat in a house full of people who trusted him. We're going to fix it, Harry had said. Yes, Spawn had said. When the time is right. The Dementors arrived at Hogsmeade Station on a night that was wrong in the specific way that September had no business producing, wet and cold and air-pressed in a way that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with what was moving through it. Harry felt them before the train stopped. Not in the way other students felt them, the cold, the despair, the surfacing of worst memories, but in the way something entirely different. He felt them the way you'd feel a vacuum, a specific absence of everything vital, a consuming quality that was reaching for something to fill itself with. He stood up before anyone else registered the change, which put him at the compartment door when it opened and the Dementor came through. It was tall and robed and wrong in the way of things that had decided they were a condition of existence rather than a creature within it. Its hands were the grey of corpses. Its face, if the dark beneath the hood could be called a face, was directed at Harry with the specific attention of something that had found what it was looking for. Most people, at this point, were falling into their worst memories. Harry heard it happening around him, Ron's sharp intake, Ginny's sudden cry, the sound of someone hitting the floor. He heard it from a distance, because the cold that the Dementor was projecting was touching him and finding very little purchase. He had grown up next to Spawn. He had grown up in a house where darkness in all its operational varieties had been a subject of study rather than a source of terror. He had grown up watching a man who had been through hell, not metaphorically, but specifically and geographically, choose every day to be something other than what that experience had made him. Harry understood darkness the way you understand the deep end of a pool when you've been swimming your whole life. You respected it. You navigated it. You did not drown in it. The Dementor pressed closer. It was doing what they did, reaching for the warmth of happiness and memory and hope, and Harry stood very still and let it try. What it found was not a void. What it found was something it didn't have a category for, a warmth that wasn't human ordinary, that had been in proximity to necroplasm long enough to carry something of its quality, not dark but deeply, rootedly resistant to being consumed. The Dementor pulled at it and found it didn't give, the way a tide finds a seawall and just pushes harder against nothing. Harry raised his wand. Expecto Patronum. The silver shape that erupted from the wand was enormous and immediate. It wasn't a gentle mist that needed coaxing, wasn't the uncertain shimmer of a charm improperly executed. It was solid and specific, a figure, not an animal, upright and vast and reaching out an arm that caught the Dementor with a force that sent it through the compartment wall and into the dark outside with a sound like something that had been told no and wasn't accustomed to the experience. The cold lifted. The compartment's occupants slowly returned to themselves. The new defense against the dark arts professor was in the corner of the compartment, which Harry had registered but not prioritized. He was thin and worn and wearing robes that had been mended too many times, and his face had the look of someone who had been having a difficult few years but had not been broken by them, and he was looking at Harry with an expression that had gone past surprise into something more complicated. That was a fully corporeal Patronus, Professor Lupin said. First attempt. I've practiced, Harry said. On what? There aren't Dementors to practice with. I improvised, Harry said, which was not exactly a lie. Lupin looked at him for a moment longer than the statement required. Then he produced a bar of chocolate from somewhere in his robes and broke it into pieces and distributed it to the compartment with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before, and Harry took his piece and ate it and found the chocolate genuinely good, which he hadn't expected. Your Patronus, Lupin said carefully. The shape of it. I know what the shape was, Harry said. It was, I know. He held Lupin's eyes. I know what it looked like. Lupin closed his mouth. Looked at Harry with the complicated expression of someone making several connections simultaneously and not being sure what to do with the conclusions. You know who I am, Harry said. Not a question. Your father's friend, Lupin said quietly. One of them. One of the ones who's still alive, Harry said. Which was not unkind, just accurate. I've been wanting to talk to you, Professor. Lupin was good at his job in a way that Lockhart had performed goodness at his job and Quirrell had failed at it. He taught with the particular effectiveness of someone who understood the difference between knowing a subject and knowing how to make other people know it, and he seemed to find a specific satisfaction in the second thing that was separate from the first. His lessons had an active quality, he brought things in, he let students engage with the actual dangerous material rather than approximating it at a safe distance, and he responded to questions as if questions were the correct response to information and not an inconvenience. He also watched Harry the way Spawn watched things, with the lateral attention of someone cataloging rather than assessing, building a picture rather than confirming one they'd already made. Harry appreciated this even as he noticed it. He noticed it particularly because Lupin was also working something out, something that had started on the Hogwarts Express and was continuing each time Harry did something that disrupted the expected, which was fairly regularly. The Boggart lesson was instructive. The class gathered in the staff room and Harry watched his classmates face their fears with the combination of discomfort and eventual humor that Ridiculous was designed to produce. Neville got Snape in his grandmother's hat and for a moment the staff room was something very close to joyful. Harry thought it was one of the better lessons he'd sat through. When it was his turn, he walked toward the wardrobe and the Boggart came out and became nothing. Not nothing literally. It shifted, reaching for shape, cycling through possibilities in the rapid frantic way of something that was looking for what it needed and not finding it in the form it expected. The class watched it cycle, formless, unstable, straining. Then it settled. It became a green-eyed shape in the dark. The familiar figure, the cape, the terrible face. But something was wrong about it, the eyes were extinguished. The figure was still, and the stillness was the wrong kind, the kind that meant absence, the kind that meant Spawn was gone and not coming back this time. The class was very quiet. Harry looked at his boggart and understood two things simultaneously. First, that his fear was specific and real and not something he'd spent much time letting himself acknowledge. Second, that the boggart had revealed it to the room, which meant he needed to deal with it now rather than process it privately. He raised his wand. He thought about the dead eyes. He thought about the thing he was afraid of, not fear for himself, not fear of Voldemort or the chamber or the dark or any of the various things that had tried to end him. The specific particular terror of losing the one person who had been there from the beginning, who had caught him in the ruins of Godric's Hollow, who had put a hand on his head at King's Cross and let him go. He thought, he's not dead. He's never died for long. And even if, I would still be what he made me. That part doesn't go. Ridiculous, he said. The cape on the boggart figure started moving. The eyes came back, green and present. And the enormous terrifying figure slowly, improbably, sat down at a kitchen table and picked up a chess piece, and challenged an empty chair across from it to a game, and waited. It was the most domestic and specific thing Harry had ever produced with a spell, and it made the boggart cycle once more in confused defeat before Lupin ended the lesson. In the corridor after, Lupin touched Harry's shoulder briefly. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Harry said. "You don't have to be." Harry looked at him. "I know." He paused. "But I am." It clarified something. Lupin looked at him with the expression he'd been carrying since the train, the one that was still assembling something. "Can I ask, your Patronus?" The figure it took. "It looked like my godfather," Harry said. "Yes." Lupin was choosing words carefully. "I knew Al, slightly. Through your father." His voice was measured, the voice of someone navigating terrain they weren't sure of. "He's not what anyone expected. As a guardian." "No," Harry agreed. "He's better." October deepened and the year arranged itself around its complications. Sirius Black's escape was a constant low hum in the school's nervous system, rumors and extra guards and the Dementors at the gates, which Harry found consistently offensive on a level he didn't always bother to articulate. He had classes with Lupin and became better at things that were already good, and he flew in cold air above the Hogwarts pitch, and he talked to Ron about nothing important and to Hermione about everything she was currently thinking, and he wrote to Spawn and got back letters that were always short and always exactly sufficient. He also began to understand that Sirius was not hunting him. It came together gradually. The details from the newspapers against the details from Spawn's account against the way Lupin talked about the past, carefully, around the edges, but with a quality that was not the caution of someone protecting the reputation of a guilty man. The way Lupin talked about Peter Pettigrew was the most informative thing. He didn't talk about Peter. In a year full of references to the past, Peter's name was a consistent absence, and absences were things Harry had learned to read. He wrote to Spawn in November, "Sirius is trying to get into the castle. 3 separate attempts according to Dumbledore. Do you know why?" The response, "He's looking for the rat." Harry sat with this for a long time. Then he wrote back, "Peter Pettigrew is alive." The response came immediately, which was unusual. Spawn's letters typically arrived in the morning, "Has been. For 12 years. He's an animagus. Transforms into a rat. I should have told you sooner, I didn't know he was at Hogwarts specifically until now." Harry folded this letter carefully and put it in his pocket and went to find Ron. Ron Weasley's rat, Scabbers, had been in the Weasley family for 12 years. He was mangy and grey and missing a toe on his front paw, and he had always been, Harry now understood, the specific kind of unremarkable that was the result of very careful effort. He stood in the dormitory looking at Scabbers sleeping in Ron's bedding and thought about what he was looking at, Peter Pettigrew, who had been a marauder, who had been James Potter's friend, who had been trusted with the location of the people Voldemort wanted most and had given it freely. Who had framed Sirius for the explosion that had killed 12 Muggles. Who had then transformed into a rat and spent 12 years hiding in the home of a family of blood traitors, perfectly placed to report back the moment there was anything worth reporting. The anger that Harry felt was cold rather than hot. He'd noticed this about himself, that strong emotions tended to run cold in him rather than volcanic, which Spawn had said was more dangerous but more useful, and Harry had said that seemed like a reasonable trade. He woke Ron up. Ron looked at him. Then at Scabbers. Then back at Harry with the slow assembling expression of someone who was about to receive information that was going to completely reorganize the last 12 years. Ron, Harry said. I need to tell you something about your rat. They told Hermione. The three of them sat in a common room past midnight with Scabbers in a cage that Ron had conjured with a spell Harry had taught him, the rat making frantic small sounds against the bars, and Harry laid it out in sequence, what Spawn had told him, what Lupin's silences suggested, what the timeline meant, what Scabbers being Pettigrew meant for Sirius. Hermione's face as she processed it moved through several distinct phases. There was shock, then the rapid analytical engagement of someone turning a new piece against the puzzle they'd been building, then a stillness that was specifically the stillness of someone arriving at the implications. Sirius Black is innocent, she said. Yes. And the Ministry, fudge, put an innocent man in Azkaban for 12 years, Harry said. Yes. Ron was looking at the cage with an expression that was complex in a way Ron's expressions weren't always complex. He'd had this rat since he was 7. He'd carried it to school, defended it from Hermione's cat, complained about it fondly in the way of someone attached to something that was objectively not impressive. The betrayal in his face was quiet and specific and real. He was just there, Ron said. In our house. All this time. Hiding, Harry said. Waiting. Ron looked at him. For what? For Voldemort to come back. For an opportunity. So he was. Ron stopped. His expression hardened into something Harry rarely saw on him, the cold version of Ron Weasley, the version that had played through a chessboard concussion first and hadn't blinked. He was spying on my family. Yes. Ron looked at the cage again. Right, he said. So we give him to Sirius. Hermione looked at him. Harry looked at him. That's the straightforward option, Ron said. Sirius is innocent, Peter is guilty, Sirius gets Peter and can prove his innocence. Straightforward. The Ministry will want to know how, Hermione started. The Ministry, Harry said, is going to be a problem regardless. But Ron's right. Sirius needs Peter. That's the step that has to happen first. He looked at the cage. Scabbers was pressed into the corner, very still now, the frantic movement stopped. And Harry looked at the small grey rat and thought about the man inside it, a man who had been afraid of Voldemort's power and had made a choice about that fear that had killed 2 people and imprisoned a 3rd, and felt nothing like pity but something that acknowledged the pathetic reality of what cowardice produced when it had enough years to fully express itself. Sirius is trying to get into the castle, Harry said. Maybe we help him with that. The meeting happened on a night in November when the grounds were dark and the Dementors at the gates were occupied with other patrols. Harry had written the letter with careful vagueness. Sirius, he was certain, was watching the castle closely enough to intercept anything addressed to the right shadow in the right place. He'd described the Whomping Willow's knot that froze its branches and the tunnel beneath, information he'd gotten from Spawn who'd gotten it from knowing James Potter, and he'd signed it simply and left it at that. Sirius was in the shrieking shack before them, which meant he'd trusted the letter enough to come in fast and ahead of them, which said something about the state he was in, 12 years of Azkaban and months of being hunted and the possibility, finally, of something that might end it. Harry came through the tunnel first with his wand out as a matter of practical caution, and Sirius was standing in the middle of the room. He was thinner than Harry had expected. Not dangerously thin, but with the thinness of someone who had been existing under a sustained difficulty for a long time and whose body had made various adjustments. His hair was long and his face had the quality of a landscape that had been through severe weather and was still recognizable. His eyes were gray and deep-set and immediately present, a sharp intelligence that Azkaban had tried to take and not quite managed. He looked at Harry. 12 years of being in Azkaban, and his first look at his best friend's son after all of it, and what his face did was something Harry filed away as one of the most honest things he'd ever seen a person's face do. It didn't perform relief or joy, it just showed them, raw and unmanaged, the way faces look when they're not doing anything but responding. "You look like James," Sirius said. "Except the eyes." "My mother's eyes," Harry said. "Yes." Sirius swallowed. "Lily's eyes." He was looking at Harry with the specific attention of someone accounting for 12 years in a single moment. "You know I didn't." "I know," Harry said. Sirius closed his eyes for a moment. "Opened them." "How long have you known?" "Since I was about 12. "Your Spawn told you?" "He was there," Harry said. "He knew the scene." "He knew you." Sirius looked at him for another long moment. Then, "Where is he?" "Outside the wards." "He doesn't come inside, Dumbledore's arrangement." "Does he know? I wrote to him." "He knows where I am." Harry stepped further into the room and held out the cage. Scabbers was rigid inside it, pressed to the back. "This is what you came for." Sirius looked at the cage. His expression went through something specific and brief and then settled into a hardness that was not anger exactly but was its functional equivalent. He looked at Peter Pettigrew's rat form with the look of 12 years concentrated into a single point of attention. "He knows," Sirius said softly. "He knows it's over." Ron and Hermione had come through behind Harry, and Sirius registered them with the quick assessment of someone who'd been a trained operative and never quite stopped, and then looked at Harry again with a question in the look. "My best friends," Harry said simply. Sirius looked at Ron and Hermione, who were looking back at him with the specific combination of wariness and readiness that Harry liked them for. Then he nodded, the way people nod when they've received information that matters to them. "Lupin should be here for this," Sirius said. "He's coming," Harry said. "I wrote to him too." Lupin arrived looking like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for 12 years and could finally see somewhere to put it down, though he wasn't quite there yet. He came through the tunnel and looked at Sirius, and something passed between them that was the full weight of what they'd been to each other and what the years between had been, and Harry gave them a moment before bringing it back to the practical because the practical was where it needed to go. Peter, forced back to human form, was everything Spawn had described and nothing less unpleasant than that. Small and gray and frightened, a man who had spent 12 years as a rat and looked like it, the fear in him so constant and so deep it seemed structural. He looked at Sirius and Lupin with the expression of an animal that had been cornered and was cataloging every exit. "There's no exit," Harry told him, before he finished cataloging. He said it without heat, just as a practical clarification. "There's no version of tonight where you walk out of here as anything other than what you are. So the only thing to decide is how hard you make this." Peter looked at him with wet, animal eyes. "Harry. Your father, James would have, my father would have been the one in Azkaban if you hadn't done what you did," Harry said. "Don't invoke him to me." Peter wilted. Sirius took custody of him with the efficient physicality of someone who had been in military and intelligence work and hadn't forgotten how. Lupin sat down heavily on the dusty floor of the shrieking shack and looked at the ceiling. 12 years, he said, to nobody specifically. 12 years, Sirius agreed. "We're going to fix it," Harry said. "Pettigrew confesses or we produce him and the truth gets out regardless. Either way, it gets done." He looked at Sirius. "It might take time. The Ministry is going to resist. Fudge has staked his credibility on your guilt." "I know," Sirius said. He was looking at Peter with the expression of someone who had imagined this moment many times and found the reality of it different from the imagination in ways he was still processing. I've had 12 years to think about what the ministry would do. There's also the matter of what happens to you in the meantime, Harry said. Until Pettigrew confesses or is produced. You can't go back to Azkaban. No, Sirius said. With complete conviction. I can't. I know somewhere you can go, Harry said. He wrote to Spawn that night from his dormitory. He wrote the full account, Peter, Sirius, the shack, what had been said and what had been decided. He wrote it cleanly and completely without embellishment because Spawn didn't need embellishment, and he ended it. I told him he could come to the farmhouse. I know I should have asked first. The response came before dawn. You didn't need to ask. Tell him he's welcome. Then, good work, Harry. This is what it looks like to actually fix a thing instead of just survive it. Then, I'll have the chess set out. 12 years in Azkaban, he'll need something to think about. Harry sat in his dormitory in the dark before dawn and read this and felt the clean particular satisfaction of something that had been wrong for 12 years beginning to move toward right. Not finished yet, the ministry remained, Fudge remained, the whole institutional weight of an organization that had committed to a false story remained. But moving. Which was the necessary first step. The Dementor problem resolved itself in a way that Harry had not exactly planned but also could not say he was surprised by. Fudge had come to Hogwarts in December for what he described as a routine inspection and what was actually an attempt to satisfy himself that the school's handling of the Sirius Black situation was appropriately vigilant. He moved through the castle with the slightly uncomfortable authority of a man who found the building's age and magic vaguely challenging to his instinct to feel in charge, and he insisted on reviewing the Dementor deployment with Dumbledore, and somehow Harry was in the room when this happened. Dumbledore had included him without explanation, which Harry had accepted with the understanding that Dumbledore was, in his roundabout way, giving him something. Fudge was soft-faced and round and wore a bowler hat that seemed somehow central to his identity. He looked at Harry with the complicated warmth of a politician encountering someone famous who they've decided to be associated with, and Harry looked back at him with the even, open attention that said nothing and revealed nothing and was, Harry had noticed, specifically unsettling to people who were accustomed to reading faces. You've been, well, Harry. The Dementors haven't been bothering you? Fudge asked, with the joviality of someone hoping the answer was yes. They've tried, Harry said. Tried? Fudge looked at Dumbledore. Looked back. And you, were all right? I was fine. Harry paused. They're affecting the other students, though. The Dementor is the wrong tool for protecting a school. It doesn't distinguish between what it's protecting against and what it's protecting. Fudge made the face of a man encountering an inconvenient argument he'd hoped not to encounter. They're necessary, I'm afraid. Given the threat, Harry said, is one escaped prisoner who, when you have the full account of what actually happened 12 years ago, turns out to have been wrongly imprisoned. The Dementors are protecting against that? He let the question sit for a moment without pushing it. Minister, Azkaban is a legitimate security facility. The Dementors there serve a function I'm not questioning. But inside a school, inside the space where children sleep and study and try to learn, they take things that don't come back. That's not protection. That's a different kind of damage. The silence in the room was very complete. Fudge looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore looked at him over his spectacles with the expression of a man who had nothing to add because everything that needed saying had been said. I'll take that under advisement, Fudge said. Thank you, Minister, Harry said, with the warmth of someone who means the gratitude at its face value and absolutely intends to hold the commitment to it. After Fudge left, Dumbledore looked at Harry for a moment and then said, "That was well done." "Was it what you wanted me to do?" Harry asked directly. Dumbledore considered. "I wanted to see what you'd do," he said. "What you did was better than what I was considering." "What were you considering?" "Making the argument through persuasion," Dumbledore said. "You made it through exposure." Fudge heard the argument from someone he can't dismiss. "He'll still dismiss it eventually," Harry said. Fudge is the kind of man who makes short-term decisions. Yes, Dumbledore agreed. But for now, it's enough. Peter Pettigrew was produced in January, through a chain of events that Dumbledore had orchestrated but that Harry had provided the essential piece of by writing Pettigrew's confession, dictated by the man himself, with Sirius and Lupin as witnesses and Harry's hand on the parchment as a kind of silent structural guarantee, the kind that came from being what he was and having Pettigrew very much aware of it. Pettigrew signed it with the small, precise signature of a man who had run out of options and was hoping cooperation would be credited in some way. Harry sent it to the Ministry through Dumbledore's office and then went to Quidditch practice, because there was a match on Saturday and the Ravenclaw seeker was good and he wanted to be better. The Ministry's response took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of bureaucratic revision and political management and Fudge's office very carefully constructing a narrative where the Ministry's error had been an understandable mistake in the heat of a difficult war rather than the imprisonment of an innocent man by a system that had decided convenience was more important than truth. Sirius was exonerated. The announcement was 2 paragraphs in the Prophet, which given what 12 years of Azkaban had cost was so inadequate that Harry found he didn't want to read it. He wrote to Spawn, "Sirius is free." "Spawn, how is he?" Harry thought about Sirius at the farmhouse, which he'd visited over the Easter holiday. Sirius who played chess with Spawn in the evenings with the fierce concentration of someone who had been starved of things that required thought. Sirius who laughed too loud sometimes and then caught himself, surprised by his own laughter, like a reflex that had been suppressed for so long it felt unfamiliar. Sirius who asked Harry questions about his childhood with the specific quality of someone accounting for lost time, absorbing each answer with an attention that was love expressed as listening. "He's finding his way back," Harry wrote. "It'll take time. But he's finding it." Spawn's response, "It always takes time. The important thing is he has it now." The end of 3rd year came with the particular quality of something that had been a very long time resolving. Exams, which Harry sat and Hermione near combusted over and Ron addressed with the focused determination of someone who had decided this year he was actually going to be prepared and had been somewhat prepared and was running the calculation on whether somewhat was enough. The results, when they came, were what they were, and the 3 of them sat in the common room on the last evening before going home and didn't talk about any of it because they'd talked about enough and the year needed a moment to just be over. Ron won. That was the framework. Ron had told them early in the year that this year Gryffindor was winning the House Cup and he'd said it with the total conviction of someone who had decided a thing rather than hoped for it. Gryffindor won the House Cup. Ron was extraordinarily specific in his celebration, which involved a particular phrase repeated at a volume that Percy found excessive and Fred and George found aspirational. In the great hall at the end of year feast, Harry sat between Ron and Hermione and looked at the table around him, the Gryffindors, the noise and color of them, the year they'd had, and felt the specific fullness of a good thing properly experienced. Not future-looking, not anxious about what was coming. Just here, in this room, with these people. Lupin stopped beside him on his way out of the hall. He'd announced his resignation that afternoon, the Prophet had identified his condition, which meant the usual thing would follow, and Lupin had moved before it completed. He looked tired in a way that was different from his usual tiredness, but not broken. "You're a remarkable person, Harry," he said, which was direct in a way Lupin didn't usually do direct, and which meant he meant it in the straightforward way rather than the complicated one. "Whatever comes next, and something will come next, remember that you've already done things that most people twice your age wouldn't have the clarity for." "You taught me most of what I needed to know this year," Harry said. "I taught you patron uses," Lupin said. "The rest you already had." He offered his hand. Harry shook it. "Tell Sirius," Lupin said, "that I'll find my own way. He doesn't need to worry." "He'll worry anyway," Harry said. "Yes," Lupin said, with the warmth of knowing something to be true. "He always did." He walked away down the hall, and the feast noise filled the space he left. Harry watched him go and thought about what was coming, not with dread, not with the particular anxiety of someone who knew what was on the other side of the calendar, but with the quality he'd been developing for 3 years now, the specific prepared awareness of someone who understood that the board was changing. Voldemort was out there, diminished and patient and biding. The Horcruxes were out there, 7 pieces of a fragmented soul spread across the world and objects that needed to be found and destroyed before any of this could actually end. He'd told Dumbledore, after the chamber, what Spawn had told him. He'd told him cleanly, over sherbet lemons in the headmaster's office, what a Horcrux was and that there were more of them, and Dumbledore had taken that information with the specific gravity of a man receiving a bill he'd known was coming and had been hoping would arrive later. They'd spoken about it twice more since then, carefully, with the mutual respect of people who acknowledged they needed each other and were working out the terms. Dumbledore was playing a long game. Harry was playing a different kind of game, not short, but direct. The difference between them was the difference between a chess player and someone who decided that the pieces could move themselves if the board were the right shape. He'd figure out the pieces before 4th year. He'd go to the farmhouse and he'd sit with Spawn at the kitchen table and they'd work it out methodically, the way they'd worked everything out, with attention and patience and the absolute absence of the kind of fear that stopped you thinking clearly. Outside the castle, in the last of the June evening, the grounds were green and warm. The term was ending. The summer was coming. The war, the real one, was still a shape on the horizon rather than a thing at the door, but it was getting larger. Harry picked up his pumpkin juice and held it toward Ron, who was still recounting the specific trajectory of the House Cup victory to anyone who would listen, and toward Hermione, who was listening with the expression of someone fondly resigned to Ron's accounting style. "Next year," Harry said. Ron lifted his goblet. Hermione lifted hers. "Next year," they said. And somewhere outside the wards, beyond the green summer grounds, a shape moved between the tree-line and the evening sky, patient, constant, and absolutely certain of every single thing it was prepared to do. Chapter 6, The Hellfire Convention. The Triwizard Tournament arrived at Hogwarts in a blaze of institutional excitement that Harry found interesting in the way he found most things interesting, as a system to understand rather than a spectacle to be absorbed by. 2 other schools. An ancient competition. A goblet that chose champions by some mechanism nobody had fully explained, and a ministry that was pouring its public relations energy into the event with the enthusiasm of an organization that needed a good story in the paper and had decided this was it. Bose Baston's carriage descended from the sky in early October like something that had decided the laws of aerodynamics were suggestions. The Durmstrang ship surfaced from the lake with a theatrical deliberateness that suggested the school had thought hard about its entrance and was committed to executing it. Harry watched both from the steps with Ron, who was processing the scale of the Beauxbatons horses with an expression that had moved through impressed and arrived somewhere that would have required more words than Ron typically deployed, and Hermione, who was making quiet assessments of the delegation structures that Harry thought were probably more accurate than anything Dumbledore's welcoming speech would cover. He also watched the Durmstrang students, because Victor Krum was among them and Victor Krum was the best seeker in the world, and Harry had specific opinions about the best seeker in the world that were less reverent and more technical than Ron's opinions, which ran toward the reverent end. "He's changed his grip," Harry said. Ron looked at him. "What?" "Since the World Cup. His broom grip. He's compensating for something." Harry watched Krum move through the entrance hall. "His shoulder, maybe. Or he's flying a different broom with different feedback." "Harry. He's Victor Krum. I know who he is. You can't critique Victor Krum's broom grip." "Why not?" Ron opened his mouth. Closed it. Looked at Hermione for support. "He's right about the grip," Hermione said, without looking up from what she was reading. Ron made a sound that communicated his feelings about being surrounded by people like this. The goblet of fire sat in the entrance hall for 2 days, burning blue-white with the specific intensity of something that was doing actual evaluative work rather than decorative burning. Students queued and submitted names with the energy of a lottery, the Weasley twins producing an aging potion that failed in a way that was spectacular enough to become immediately legendary. Harry didn't submit his name. He'd thought about it, decided the tournament was engineered toward a specific kind of outcome, and concluded that the interesting things about 4th year weren't going to happen in an officially sanctioned competition. He was wrong about the last part. Not about the tournament, but about what the tournament was actually for. The goblet spat 3 names, and then it spat a 4th. Harry Potter. He was at the Gryffindor table when it happened, and the silence that followed his name was the particular silence of a room in which several hundred people were simultaneously revising their understanding of something. He stood up because the alternative was to sit there being looked at, and he walked to the front, and he looked at the goblet and looked at Dumbledore and kept his face neutral. Dumbledore's face was not neutral. It passed through several things very fast and arrived at a controlled concern that Harry read as, "This is what I was afraid of and I couldn't prevent it, and someone did this deliberately." "Did you submit your name?" Bartemius Crouch asked. He had the voice of a man who had built his identity entirely out of procedural correctness and found this situation threatening to the infrastructure. "No," Harry said. "Someone else submitted it," Hermione said, from the Gryffindor table, clearly and without hesitation. Several heads turned. She looked back at them all with the expression of someone stating a fact that ought to be obvious. The age line was impassable for students who tried to submit their own names. Someone submitted Harry's for him. From outside the age line. Dumbledore looked at Harry over the spectacles with his real attention. "Harry. You understand that the goblet selection is binding." "I understand that someone made it binding without my consent," Harry said. "That's a different situation from the one the contract was designed for." Bartemius Crouch made a sound that suggested the distinction was lost on him. "Nevertheless," Dumbledore said, "the magical contract." "I'll compete," Harry said. "Not because of the contract. Because whoever put my name in that goblet had a reason, and I want to know what it is." The room was very quiet. Dumbledore looked at him with the expression that Harry had started to think of as the headmaster's real expression, not the warm grandfather performance but the older and more honest thing underneath it. "Yes," Dumbledore said softly. "So would I." He wrote to Spawn that night. He wrote everything, the goblet, the 4th name, the 3 tasks ahead, the specific feeling of a thing designed and pointed at him from a distance. He didn't write with alarm. He wrote with the focused attention of someone identifying a threat's shape. Spawn's response came before he'd finished breakfast: "Someone needs you in that tournament." The tournament ends with something specific, a port key, probably, something that moves you to a location of their choosing. What they need at that location is your blood. Don't ask why yet. Just understand that they need you alive until the end of the final task, and they need you to arrive at wherever the port key takes you. Which means you have an advantage: they can't kill you early. Use it. I'll be watching the tasks. You won't see me. You don't need to. The last line was, characteristically, the truest thing in the letter. The first task was dragons. Harry found out through Hagrid, who had a consistent relationship with secrets that could be charitably described as aspirational, and he received the information with the equanimity of someone for whom dragons were, comparatively, a manageable problem. He told Cedric Diggory, because Cedric had been working with a disadvantage that wasn't his fault and Harry didn't compete by letting other people get hurt for the sake of his score. Cedric looked at him when he told him. Looked at him with the slightly disoriented expression that Harry was accustomed to receiving when he did something that people hadn't expected. "Why are you telling me?" Cedric asked. "Because you'd do the same for me," Harry said. Which he believed, and which made Cedric's face do something warm and slightly uncertain, the expression of a person being offered a version of themselves they were glad to be held to. The dragons were 1 each, a Hungarian horntail for Harry, which the dragon wranglers appeared to consider a significant joke at his expense. Harry spent the night before the task not in a state of fear but in a state of planning, working through the problem with the same clean geometric thinking he applied to Quidditch, to chess problems Spawn had assigned him, to every challenge that had a physical component and a logical solution. The arena was full. He came out into the noise and the October cold and the immediate aggressive presence of the Hungarian horntail, which was the largest and most aggressively territorial of the dragon species and had apparently decided that the stadium and its surrounding air represented an extension of its nest, And Harry stood at the entrance and looked at it and felt his magic sharpen into the specific quality it took on when he was about to do something that required everything to be exactly right. He called his firebolt. Flew. The dragon was fast and enormous and operating on the logic of something that had been apex predator for millions of years, and Harry flew it the way he flew everything, not against it but through its logic, finding the gaps where the physics of something that large created blind spots and angles of approach that weren't what they seemed from the ground. He was past it for the egg in under 4 minutes. The crowd noise was something he registered as background information. He caught the golden egg and looped twice above the arena because the dragon was still trying to track him and he needed it oriented away before he landed, and he touched down cleanly and the roar from the stands was the specific all-stadium roar of several thousand people who had just seen something that exceeded what they'd come to see. In the champion's tent afterward, Fleur Delacour looked at him over her water glass and said, in her precise accented English, "You fly like you have nothing to fear." "I fly like I know where I'm going," Harry said. Which was the more honest version? She smiled at him with an expression that was assessment and approval in equal parts. That is better. Between tasks, Hogwarts accumulated the specific social energy of a school hosting an international event, louder, denser, more performative than its usual self. The Yule Ball was the clearest expression of this, a formal dance that required partners and dress robes and the particular anxiety of adolescent social navigation under an increased stakes environment. Harry asked Parvati Patil, who said yes with the enthusiasm of someone who had been hoping to be asked and who Harry made a genuine effort to actually spend the evening with rather than use as cover for standing in corners thinking about other things, because she'd said yes and that deserved to be honored. He danced badly but with commitment, which she found funny rather than frustrating, and he listened to her talk about her sister and her plans and her opinions on the decorations and he was actually present for it, because Spawn had taught him years ago that the quality of attention you gave to the ordinary moments was what made you a person worth knowing. Ron, however, did not ask Hermione, and Hermione did not wait, and Hermione arrived at the ball on Viktor Krum's arm wearing something blue and with her hair doing something other than what it usually did, and the expression on Ron's face when he saw her was the expression of someone understanding something they should have understood months ago. Harry looked at Ron's face and looked at Hermione and looked back at Ron and understood that this was going to be a complicated thing for a while and that the right approach was patience and honesty applied carefully. After the ball, on the stone steps outside in the cold, with the distant sound of the music still going, "You should tell her," Harry said. "Tell her what?" Ron said, immediately, defensively, which was Ron telling him he knew exactly what. "That you're an idiot and you should have asked her." "I know I should have asked her." "She knows you know. She's waiting for you to say it." Ron looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Because she's Hermione. She already knows what she thinks. She's waiting to find out what you think." Harry looked out at the grounds. "She'll wait, but she won't wait forever, because she has too much self-respect for that." Which is correct. Ron sat with this for a while in the cold. "When did you get smart about people?" "I've always been smart about people," Harry said. "You just notice it when it's about you." Ron made the sound he made when he couldn't argue with something. Then he pulled his robes tighter against the cold and said, "She looked brilliant." "Yes," Harry said. "She always looks, I mean she's always, Ron." "Yeah. Talk to her." "Not tonight. When you've figured out how to say it." "What if I can't figure out how to say it?" "Then say the wrong thing," Harry said. "She'll correct you and then you'll both know where you are." Ron laughed in spite of himself. Looked at Harry. "What about you? What about me?" "You're not, is there anyone, not this year," Harry said, which was honest. There was something theoretical in the direction of Cho Chang and something entirely different in the direction of the Beauxbatons delegation that he'd noticed and not done anything with, but the year was too full of things with teeth for romance to feel like something he could give the right amount of attention to. "Ask me later." "Cho's been looking at you." "I know. And the French one." "I know." "You know," Ron said, "for someone who acts like they don't notice things, you notice everything." I noticed the things that matter, Harry said, which was Spawn's line, said at the kitchen table years ago, and which Harry had absorbed so thoroughly it came out in his own voice now. The second task was the lake, and the thing at the bottom of the lake was the thing each champion would miss most. Harry came up from the black water with Ron on one arm and Fleur's sister Gabrielle on the other, because Fleur hadn't made it and her sister had been going to drown for the sake of a task's timing constraints, and this had been an obvious decision that apparently surprised the judges. Dumbledore watched him from the dock with the expression he kept bringing to Harry's actions, the recalibration, the quiet accounting for something that exceeded the frame. Second place, Harry told Ron, treading water weight in his clothes and his hair flattened against his face, Gabrielle already safely on the dock. Behind Cedric. He was faster. You stopped for a stranger, Hermione said from the dock, in the tone of someone explaining something to a scorekeeper who didn't understand the relevant metric. She was going to die, Harry said, as if this was a complete argument, which to him it was. You'll get points for moral fiber, Hermione said. I don't need the points, Harry said. I need to know what the third task is. April brought the maze, and the maze brought everything to a head. Harry spent the time between the second task and the third building information and watching Moody, Mad-Eye Moody, the legendary Auror, Dumbledore's appointment for defense that had arrived with a wooden leg and a magical eye and a reputation that the students treated with something between reverence and careful caution. Harry had watched Moody since September with the same quality of attention he'd given Quirrell in first year, for different reasons. Moody moved right. Moody talked right. Moody's paranoia and aggression read as authentic rather than performed. But there was something. A quality that was very slightly off in the way of a note that was in key but not in tune. He mentioned it to Dumbledore in March, in the headmaster's office, with the direct approach he'd decided sometime in the last year was the only efficient approach to Dumbledore. Something is wrong with Moody, Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him over the spectacles. What specifically? I don't know specifically. Something layered, like Quirrell. But different, not possession. More like, substitution. The spectacles came off. Dumbledore set them on the desk and looked at Harry without them, and the face that looked at him was older and more tired and more honest than the face that usually managed these conversations. I've had the same suspicion, Dumbledore said quietly. For some weeks. Why haven't you acted on it? Because acting on it requires certainty, and certainty requires allowing the plan to proceed far enough to reveal itself. Harry looked at him. What does the plan need to proceed to? The third task, Dumbledore said. The portkey. Harry thought about Spawn's letter. The tournament ends with something specific. You knew about the portkey. I suspected. And you let me compete anyway. I tried to end your involvement in November and was told, by you, that you wanted to know what they were doing and why. Dumbledore held his gaze. I made a judgment that you were better informed than you would be if I excluded you. I may have been wrong. You weren't wrong, Harry said. I want to be there when it happens. I need to be there. Harry, he's going to resurrect using my blood, Harry said. I know about the ritual. I know what it needs. He held Dumbledore's eyes. Which means I'm the only person in the building who can be in that graveyard and have a reason to come back from it. The silence in the office was total. The portraits on the walls had the stilled quality of painted figures paying close attention. I'm not asking for permission, Harry said. I'm telling you what's going to happen, because you should know, and because I need you to be ready to move when I give you a signal. What signal? Dumbledore asked. You'll know it, Harry said. I'll make it obvious. He stood up. Looked at Dumbledore, the old face, the tired eyes, the man who had been playing this game for 60 years and had the specific damage of someone who had won enough to keep going and lost enough to understand the cost. One more thing, Harry said. Yes. Spawn is going to be in the graveyard. He said it evenly, as information rather than apology. He'll arrive when things begin. I know he's outside the wards and you've kept him there and I've respected that arrangement. This is different. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. I know, he said finally. And the weight of that, the acknowledgement that Spawn's presence was not just expected but necessary, was, Harry thought, the most honest thing the headmaster had ever said to him. The maze was the third task and the maze was enormous and alive. Harry moved through it with the constant sensory alertness of someone who had been trained to read his environment the way other people read text, the sound of the hedges, the air pressure changes that indicated open space ahead, the specific magical signatures of the hazards that had been placed inside with an apparent enthusiasm for variety. A blast-ended scrut. A sphinx with a riddle, which Harry answered correctly and which the sphinx let him pass with what seemed like genuine satisfaction. A boggart, which he dispatched so fast it barely had time to register a shape. He found Cedric near the center. Cedric was injured, not badly, but enough, and Harry helped him to his feet and they moved together toward the glowing Triwizard Cup at the maze's heart. We should both grab it, Cedric said. Cedric. Harry looked at him. I need you to listen to me for a moment. The cup is a portkey. What's on the other side isn't a finish line. Cedric looked at him with the specific expression of someone receiving information they'd rather not have. How do you know? I've known since October what this task was actually for. Harry held his gaze. What happens at the portkey location is going to be dangerous. I want you to go back. Harry, you've been in this maze for 2 hours. You're hurt. Your family is in the stands. Harry looked at him steadily. There is nothing on the other side of that cup that requires you specifically. There is something on the other side that requires me specifically. That's the difference. Cedric looked at the cup. Looked at Harry. What is it for? What are they trying to do? Bring back someone who should stay dead, Harry said. A long silence. Will you be all right? Cedric asked. Yes, Harry said. Which was not guaranteed but was, he believed, accurate. Cedric put his hand on Harry's shoulder. Come back, he said, with the directness of someone who meant it completely. I intend to, Harry said. He walked to the cup and grabbed it, and the world ended and began again. The graveyard was in Little Hangleton, which Harry knew from Dumbledore's account of Tom Riddle's history, and it was dark and cold and had the specific quality of a place that had been used for bad things enough times that the ground had absorbed the record of it. Riddle's grave was here, the old headstone, the family name carved in stone, the yew tree, all of it exactly as Spawn's briefing had described and Dumbledore's account had confirmed. Pettigrew was there. The fact of Pettigrew, still alive, silver-handed, having cooperated with the Ministry's investigation while negotiating a leniency Harry found genuinely offensive, was a specific note in the knight's composition that Harry filed without expression. Peter looked at him with the wet eyes of a man who had been making survival calculations for his entire life and was currently deep in one. The bundle in Peter's arms was the other thing. Small and malformed and aware, Harry could feel it across the clearing, the specific quality of consciousness without a proper vessel, a soul fragment that had been surviving at the edge of existence for 14 years and had, finally, found the conditions for something more. Hold him, Peter said, to something else, and the ropes that came were immediate and tight and Harry let them bind him to the gravestone because this was the part where he needed to be here, and being here meant being present for the whole of it. The cauldron. The ritual. Peter cutting his hand and offering flesh, the bone of Tom Riddle Sr. exhumed, and then Peter's silver hand to Harry's arm, the cut quick and precise, the blood that welled up running down into the dark cauldron water. Harry watched his blood go into the cauldron and felt the thing inside him, the necroplasm-adjacent quality in his blood, and he thought, go. Do what you do. The potion turned bone white and then bone red and then the figure rose from it. Tom Riddle. Voldemort. Whole and present in a body that was white as chalk and snake flat-nosed and red-eyed and radiating the kind of dark that had been patient for 14 years and was done being patient. He stood in his conjured robes and felt his body with the specific satisfaction of something that had been waiting to feel a body again for a very long time. Then he stopped. He looked at his hands. He looked at the cauldron water. He raised his wand and cast a diagnostic spell on himself, the magical equivalent of taking stock, and something changed in his face, the satisfaction becoming something else, something that was making a rapid and unpleasant assessment. "What," he said, very quietly, "is in my blood?" Harry said nothing. Voldemort looked at him with the full red-eyed attention of a mind that had been surviving and calculating for 60 years and understood immediately that something was wrong in a way he hadn't planned for. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything," Harry said. "That's what I am." The Death Eaters began arriving. The dark mark above the graveyard pulling them in from across the country and across the continent, operating in their black robes and their masks, forming the circle with the specific behavior of people who had been called and were performing their response to being called. There were 12 of them, then 16, then more, the full roster of those still alive and still bound, and Harry stood tied to the gravestone and looked at them and catalogued each face as the masks came off for Voldemort's inspection. Lucius Malfoy. Harry looked at him specifically, the long blonde hair, the composure of someone who had managed to stay on the right side of every political wind for 20 years, and the thing underneath the composure which was the same fear that lived in his son but fully developed, deeply practiced at being hidden. Voldemort was speaking. The speech of someone who had imagined this moment and was delivering it with the precision of long-prepared performance. The Death Eaters reduced to their failures, welcomed back, the new order announced, Harry Potter the living proof of his triumph. Harry listened to it with the patience of someone who understood that the speech was necessary but not for the audience. Voldemort thought. The speech ended. "Untie him," Voldemort said. "Let's see what 14 years has made of the boy who survived." The ropes fell. Harry stood straight. He and Voldemort looked at each other across the dark graveyard, and Harry felt the connection between their wands, the dead brother cores that were going to do something specific when they met, and underneath that he felt the necroplasm in his blood sitting like a charge that had been waiting to discharge, and underneath that he felt the thing in the air that had been arriving since the port key landed. The darkness at the graveyard's edge had a different quality now. Not the dark of night. Not the dark of clouds over a new moon. Something structural, a dark that was also a presence, that moved with purpose and with weight. 2 points of green light at the tree-line. Voldemort followed Harry's line of sight. Looked at the green lights. And Harry watched, with genuine attention, as Tom Riddle, who had been afraid of almost nothing for 60 years except death itself, registered what he was looking at and experienced something new. "What," Voldemort said, "is that?" "My godfather," Harry said. Spawn stepped out of the tree-line. He came into the graveyard the way he'd come into every situation for 20 years, without hurry, without performance, with the absolute physical certainty of something that had already decided how this was going to go. The cape moved. The green eyes moved across the circle of Death Eaters with a quality of attention that was not like being watched by a person. It was like being read. Catalogued. Assessed for what they were and found, each of them, to be exactly the sum of their choices. The Death Eaters moved. Not forward, back. A collective, involuntary half-step backward, the deep animal instinct of people whose bodies understood something that their ideology hadn't prepared them for. Lucius Malfoy's composure cracked in a way that his son had only been performing, the real version, the version where the body overrides the performance. "Kill it," Voldemort said. His voice was controlled. The control cost him something. 3 Death Eaters raised their wands. 3 killing curses left 3 wands. The Avada Kedavra was green. It was instant. It had killed everything it had ever been pointed at. The 3 curses hit Spawn and the cape absorbed them with the indifferent totality of something that had made its peace with death 14 years ago and found Avada Kedavra to be a notably unpersuasive argument. The green of the curses vanished into the black of the cape like light hitting a surface that had decided not to reflect. The silence that followed was the silence of a paradigm failing. "I've been dead," Spawn said. His voice was even and deep and carried in the graveyard air. He was looking at the 3 Death Eaters who had cast. "That's not a threat you can make to me." He moved. The first Death Eater, a man whose mask was still on, whose name Harry would learn was Avery, simply ceased to be present in the space he'd been standing in. The darkness took him with a speed that was something other than physical, a reaching that came from Spawn's cape like an extension of his will, and Avery was there and then he was somewhere else, somewhere that had nothing to do with the graveyard, and the sound he made on his way was the sound of something falling a very long distance. The second Death Eater got 3 steps of running in before the same thing happened. The third one tried Fiend Fire, the cursed fire, the consuming magical flame, and Spawn looked at it with the patience of someone who had stood in hellfire for 20 years and let it come, and the Fiend Fire did what fire in proximity to necroplasm did, which was reconsider. It guttered and died at Spawn's outline like a wave hitting a cliff. Voldemort had been watching. Harry could feel him, the calculations happening behind the red eyes, the rapid reassessment of a brilliant mind encountering something that invalidated the framework it was working within. He was afraid. Not the human ordinary fear of pain or death, Tom Riddle had burnt those out of himself deliberately long ago. But the specific, deep, structural fear of the thing he'd spent his life trying to escape. Not death. Something that had been past death and had come back from it as something else entirely. Interesting, Voldemort said. And the word was almost steady. You used his blood, Spawn said. He was looking at Voldemort now with the full attention he'd given Avery and the second Death Eater before the darkness had taken them. You wanted his protection. His mother's protection. You put it inside yourself. Yes, Voldemort said. What you also put inside yourself, Spawn said, is 14 years of what that blood has been near. Voldemort looked down at his hands again. Something was moving under the chalk-white skin, not visible exactly, but present, a current beneath the surface, a slow and deliberate process beginning. What did you do? Voldemort said, and this time it wasn't a question, it was the voice of something that was starting to understand and finding the understanding catastrophic. I raised him, Spawn said simply. For 14 years. In a house where what I am was in the walls and the air and the water and the ground. He walked toward Voldemort with the measured pace of someone who had decided on a direction and was following it at their own speed. You wanted his blood for its protection. You got his blood. Everything in it. Harry freed himself from the gravestone, the ropes were already loose, Spawn's arrival having disrupted the attention that maintained them, and picked up his wand from where it had fallen. Around the circle, Death Eaters were in various states of incapacitation or frozen stillness. 2 more had been taken by the darkness at the edge of the graveyard. Several were backing away with the specific body language of people who had identified an exit and were calculating whether they could reach it. Harry, Spawn said, without looking away from Voldemort. You know what needs to happen. Harry raised his wand. He thought about the Horcruxes, the diary destroyed in the chamber, the locket destroyed the previous summer when he and Dumbledore had tracked it through 3 countries and a very unpleasant cave, the cup found in Bellatrix Lestrange's vault through a mechanism that had required Hermione's intelligence and a dragon and a significant amount of improvisation. The ring, dealt with, at cost, by Dumbledore in September. The snake, Nagini, coiled somewhere near Voldemort at a distance that Harry could now cross. The snake was the last Horcrux. The vessel carrying the last fragment of Tom Riddle's divided soul. He looked at it. He thought about Parseltongue, the gift that had come from that Halloween night, from the accidental soul fragment that had been destroyed in the chamber, the fragment whose destruction had taken the Parselmouth ability with it for most of second year before it had gradually, unexpectedly returned in a different form, cleaner and more deliberate. He spoke to the snake. Not the command a Parselmouth lord would give, not an order, not the language of control that Slytherin had developed and Voldemort had inherited. The kind of Parseltongue that Harry had, which was the kind that had grown back from a destroyed piece of dark soul and been reconfigured by proximity to something entirely different. He told the snake what it was and what it was carrying and what the fragment inside it had been before it was a fragment, and he told it this the way you tell a living thing the truth when the truth is the thing that sets it free. Nagini looked at him with ancient golden eyes. And then she simply left. She uncoiled and moved through the graveyard grass with the swift directional certainty of a living thing that had just been released from something, and she was gone into the dark, and the last Horcrux went with her, not in the snake, not anymore. The fragment separated from its vessel by the specific and previously undocumented effect of being addressed in the language of its creator by someone whose blood carried what Harry's blood carried. The fragment rose from the snake's departure point like smoke going up, thin and dispossessed and very, very old, and it made a sound that Harry would never describe accurately to anyone because it was the sound of a piece of a human soul finding out what it had been part of and what it had cost, and then it was gone. Voldemort screamed. Not the controlled, planned scream of someone executing an effect. The genuine, tearing scream of someone who had felt something ripped away and understood, in the moment of ripping, that all of it was being ripped away, every Horcrux, every carefully placed fragment, every piece of the architecture of immortality he'd spent 60 years constructing. Gone. Not destroyed in the usual way, not burned or stabbed or dissolved. Something worse, freed. Released from purpose. Made unnecessary by the fact of a soul that, when it was completed enough to feel the gravity of what Tom Riddle had actually done and actually been, simply chose not to persist. He was mortal. He'd been mortal from the moment Harry had come through the port key, from the moment the ritual had used blood that had been living inside Necroplasm's influence for 14 years. He'd been mortal and hadn't known it, and now he knew it, and he was standing in a graveyard with Spawn 12 feet away and the knowledge that death was not an argument anymore. Harry walked toward him. Voldemort raised his wand. The killing curse came fast and green and Harry sidestepped it with the ease of someone who had practiced exactly this response because Spawn had made him practice it 100 times in a field in Connecticut, and his wand was already moving, not Avada Kedavra, not the killing curse, because Harry did not kill with spells. Because Harry had been taught the difference between ending a threat and deciding to take a life and that the decision about which you were doing needed to be made before. The wand came up not after. Expelliarmus. The spell that was Harry's, not assigned to him, not a weakness as Voldemort had always called it, but the signature of someone who had decided what they were about and committed to it. The disarming charm hit Voldemort's wand and sent it up and away into the dark, and Voldemort stood wandless in his own graveyard in his resurrected body with the necroplasm working through his blood and no fragment of his soul anchored anywhere in the world to preserve him. He looked at Harry. His face did the thing that Tom Riddle's face had done in the chamber, projected through 60 more years of consequence, the boy who had been afraid, multiplied by a life spent making everything else afraid, arriving finally at the irreducible thing. It wasn't supposed to end like this, Voldemort said. It never is, Harry said. Spawn's hand came down on Voldemort's shoulder from behind. The touch was not violent. It was gentle, in the way that things that had accepted their nature could be gentle without pretending the nature away. Tom Riddle, Spawn said. Voldemort looked up at him. The red eyes. The white face. A man who had been afraid of death for 60 years, standing in front of something that had been past death and returned from it. There's a place for everyone who leaves, Spawn said. What place you go depends on what you've been. I know where I'm going, Voldemort said. His voice was flat. The calculation was still in it, even now, a man taking stock. Yes, Spawn said. You do. Voldemort closed his eyes. And what happened next was not violence, or not in any form that Harry could describe with precision to anyone who asked later. The darkness moved. The cape extended. Something that had been walking around inside Tom Riddle's resurrected body for 60 years, the original fragment around which all the others had been anchored, decided that without its architecture to sustain it, it was done, and the body that had been so laboriously constructed simply stopped. The graveyard was quiet. The remaining Death Eaters, some frozen in place, some back to the perimeter, Lucius Malfoy still standing near the center with his wand at his side in the posture of someone who had not yet processed that they needed to decide something, looked at the empty space where Voldemort had been. Harry looked at them. He looked at them the way Spawn looked at things, the full inventory of them, what they were and what they'd done and what they represented, and he felt the specific cold anger that he'd felt in the dormitory looking at Scabbers, the anger that was useful rather than reactive. You know what he was, Harry said. His voice carried clearly in the graveyard quiet. You made the choice to be part of it. Some of you made that choice more than once. He looked at Lucius specifically for a moment before returning to the group. Tonight is over. What comes after tonight is on you. He looked at Spawn. Spawn was looking at the perimeter. The darkness at the edge had 3 more shapes in it, the shadows taking attendance, accounting for the ones who tried to run and found that the graveyard had a different geometry than it had when they arrived. The shapes made sounds. They would continue to make sounds, Harry understood, in whatever place the shadows had taken them, for a very long time. He did not feel sorry for this. The signal for Dumbledore. Harry raised his wand and sent up a lumos that was not the Ministry's dark mark but was the specific blue-white of the light in Dumbledore's office on late evenings, a color that was coded between them from the conversation in March. 3 bursts. The sky above the graveyard went blue-white 3 times. Dumbledore arrived in 4 minutes, with a speed that told Harry he'd been waiting close by, and with orders behind him, and with the contained, absolute authority of a man who had been building toward this night for 30 years and was now arriving at it in a manner that was nothing like he'd planned and entirely better than he'd feared. He looked at the graveyard. He looked at what was left of the Death Eaters, those still standing, those the darkness had taken, Lucius Malfoy with his wand on the ground and his hands visible in the specific posture of someone who had made a pragmatic decision. He looked at Spawn. The 2 of them regarded each other. The history between them, the rainy Halloween night, the years of uneasy arrangement, the chess game of an old man who planned carefully and a dead man who refused to be played, sat in the air between them without needing to be spoken. "Thank you," Dumbledore said. And it was without theater and without management. Just the 2 words, given their full weight. Spawn looked at him for a long moment. Then he made a sound that was not quite acknowledgement and not quite acceptance and was something more complicated than both, the sound of a man who had spent years not forgiving something and had arrived, without deciding to, at the territory past it. He looked at Harry. Harry was standing in the graveyard with his wand in his hand and his robes dark with graveyard grass and the cold night air, 14 years old and carrying everything he was. He looked back at Spawn with the same face he'd had at 15 months, the face that had grabbed 2 of Spawn's fingers in the ruins of Godric's Hollow and held on. "Good," Spawn said. "Good," Harry said. They walked out of the graveyard together, Harry and Spawn, in the way they'd been doing things together for 14 years, without ceremony, without theater, just moving in the same direction because that was where they were both going. The night was cold. The stars above the little Hangleton Hills were the kind of stars that appear when you get far enough from the lights of occupied places, dense and close and old. Harry looked up at them as they walked and felt the specific, complete quality of something finished, not all of it, never all of it at once, but this part. This long and difficult and necessary part. "The Horcruxes," Harry said. "Done. The Death Eaters. The ones tonight will be accounted for," Spawn said. "The others will turn themselves in or they won't, and the ones who don't will be found. Voldemort. Done." Harry was quiet for a moment. "Is he actually done?" "The soul fragment, what I touched was what was left of him after all the rest had gone," Spawn said. "There was almost nothing. What was there went where it belongs." A pause. "He's done, Harry." They walked. The Aurors were working the graveyard behind them. Dumbledore's voice carried on the still air, organizing the aftermath with the practiced authority of a man who had done this before and knew the sequence. The world, slowly and messily and in the imperfect way of real endings, was beginning to rearrange itself around the fact that the thing it had been afraid of for 30 years was gone. "What happens now?" Harry asked. It was not a frightened question. He asked it the way he asked most things, with genuine curiosity, as someone who wanted to know rather than someone who needed reassurance. Spawn looked at the stars. "You go back to school. You finish your education. You get 7 years of being 17 without something trying to kill you, which you've earned." He paused. "Ron figures out how to tell Hermione what he thinks. You figure out what you want to do with the rest of your life. And you?" Spawn was quiet in a way that meant he was choosing exactly the right words. "I'll be around," he said. Harry smiled. It was a rare full smile, the kind that reached everywhere. "You always say that." "I always mean it." Harry looked back toward the castle, which was visible now as they crested the hill, the lights of it, the towers, the impossible persistent warmth of 1,000 years of human learning and living and occasionally catastrophic decision-making. His school. His home, in the way that the farmhouse was home and Spawn's constant presence was home and Ron's voice and Hermione's books and all of it was home, the accumulated human collection of things he'd chosen and that had chosen him back. He thought about everything ahead. The years of school still to go. The wizarding world rearranging itself around the absence of the thing it had built itself in opposition to. Dumbledore's long game winding down into something smaller and more human. Sirius finding out, from the farmhouse, what had happened tonight, and the sound he would make when he heard. He thought about Hermione asking, with her complete and precise attention, for the full account, and Ron making tea because Ron always made tea when something important had happened, and the three of them in the Gryffindor common room going through it piece by piece until they understood it completely. He thought about the summer. About the farmhouse and the field behind it and the chess games and the evenings, and the specific sound of the farmhouse at night, which he'd been hearing his whole life and still hadn't stopped finding comforting. "Come on," Harry said. "Let's go back." They walked down the hill toward the lights of the world, the boy and the Hellspawn, side by side in the dark, and the dark was not something that threatened them. It was something they moved through. Together. The way they always had.